I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Middlestack, could you please call attendance?
Okay, Ms. Burkmeyer? Ms. Burkmeyer?
I'm here.
Somebody needs to unmute me.
We hear you.
Okay, Ken, all right. Ms. Burkmeyer, yes.
Yes.
Mr.
Here.
Moses?
Mr. Moses is excused.
Mr. Green?
Here.
Ms. Knox?
Here.
Mr. Richards?
Here.
Mr. DeRue?
Here.
Mr. Middlestadt, New Baltimore.
Thank you. Yes, sir. So at this time, on behalf of the Anchor Bay School District, I would like to welcome Mr. John Dean to this interview for the position of superintendent. Dr. Dean is currently the Deputy Superintendent for Educational Services for Grosse Pointe Public Schools. I'll take just a moment to remind of our format. The interview may be up to 90 minutes long. There are 24 questions from the board. Toward the end of the interview, time permitting, we will give the candidate an opportunity to ask questions of the board and make a closing statement. And we will let you know if time is becoming an issue and if there is a need to pick up the pace of response. As the board hears from each candidate and weighs this critical decision, it will be doing so through the lens of the candidate profile that was developed with considerable input from our stakeholders. Our intent is to identify the candidate that best fits this profile, which board members have at hand. Audience feedback may be submitted by those who are present on a form located at the table of the entrance to the auditorium. Those participating virtually may provide feedback electronically by the way of the link provided for this purpose. Although the task of choosing our next superintendent is the responsibility of the Board of Education as the elected representatives of our community, we value and consider the input of our stakeholders in the process as well. So I am Lisa Burkmeyer, the school board president. We have Mr. Steve Middlestadt, who is virtually attending the meeting. Next to me is Mr. Patrick Green, followed by Mr. John DeRue, Mr. Dennis Richards, and Ms. Jill Knox. Are we ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Dr. Dean, while we have had the opportunity to review your application materials, audience members here and those viewing from home have not. Please briefly review your background and share what causes you to be interested in this position at this point of your career.
Thank you, Mrs. Burkmeyer. First, I want to share that I'm really honored and privileged to be here today. It does feel strange to start an interview and not shake hands and all those sorts of pieces. So it is kind of a strange sort of dissonance, right? To explain yourself, but still be this distant. So I'll try to work my way through it. As Lisa shared, Mrs. Burkmeyer shared, my name is John Dean. I'm currently the Deputy Superintendent for Educational Services in the Grosse Pointe Public Schools. And I've been doing that for 9 years. And I'm sure you're wondering, well, that's a really long title because educators are good at that. But what does that mean I do? Well, really, I think of my responsibility in the Grosse Pointe Public Schools is I'm the guy that people come to when we have a tough decision or there's a problem and we try to figure out a solution. I'm not the answers guy, but I'm the guy that helps the people figure out what the right answer is or get us to that answer. Now, what specifically do? I have final responsibility for all things related to human resources in the school district. So final responsibility for developing a teacher hiring process and implementing it. A lot of hands-on responsibility for hiring and implementing a process to hire school administrators. I am the chief negotiator for collective bargaining agreements. I have dotted line responsibility to supervise the instruction department, the technology department, the special education department. Really, I'm the person that the building principals call when there's something going on and we need to try to work through something. I serve as I'm the primary person that consults on student discipline. I am also the chief hearing officer for student discipline situations in the school district. Thankfully, just like here, we don't have to do that very often. On top of those sorts of things, I'm also the liaison with the Board of Education for board policy and a member of pretty much every board committee that our district has, and we have our fair share. And then like everyone else, including all of you, for the last 13 months, I'm heavily involved in our response to COVID. And that's really what, like for you probably, and I've seen your board meetings, you spend time talking about it too. That's really what I end up spending a lot of my time on, figuring out how can we manage this safely, effectively, and provide kids an education in these unprecedented times. Prior to working in Grosse Pointe for 9 years, I was the assistant superintendent for human resources in the Birmingham Public Schools. I was an elementary principal in 3 different districts, including right next door in Algonac. Feels like a lifetime ago. And the best job I ever had was I was a high school math teacher for 5 years. Outside of my formal work experience, I have an earned doctorate degree from Wayne State University in Education Policy Studies. I'm a member of the adjunct faculty there. I teach the school law class, Introduction to the Principalship, School HR, and Staff Development, School Improvement. So that's my background, but I really think what you want to know is the why, right? You want to figure out why is he here and is he a good fit? So I want to try to explain to you the 3 things that I think I bring and the 3 reasons that I see you being a good match for me. The first is we both, meaning your district and myself, have a commitment to relationships. We are a people business. We don't make a product. We rarely, arguably, don't sell a product either. What we do is we work with people. Sometimes they're our community members, sometimes they're our staff, sometimes they're the Board of Education, to come up with collaborative solutions to serve kids. And the only way that happens, or the best way it happens, the best way we can assure that it works the best for kids is to have relationships first. So when I think about the things that I've done in my school district that I'm proud of, or the things that I think have worked well, it really started with relationships first. Whether that's us making a big decision or a little decision, an individual decision, like today we hired an administrator, or the decision to adopt a piece of curriculum, or even those hard, painful decisions to make a COVID-based decision or to close a school building. All of those go back to forming relationships. And that's really the first core of my leadership style or focus. The second area of focus for me, and the second reason I think I'm here today, or I think I'm a good match for your school district, is a commitment to process. School districts need to function in an environment that builds trust with stakeholders, whether those stakeholders are your employees, they're your students, or your community. And the best way to build trust and to get the best possible outcome is to have a process for making the decisions that you're going to make. So how do we go about hiring the very best teachers? By thinking ahead of time before we have to hire the teachers and putting in place a collaborative process, not that I invented, but that the stakeholders were involved with. So in that case, it might be building principles. Frankly, it could be a union. It could be a variety of people coming together and figuring out how should we go about this thing. We put that process in place, we view it as a commitment, and then we follow it. That not only guarantees the best possible outcome, but it also builds trust. Because when you do what you say you're going to do, you actually grow trust. And that's an important thing. That's something I would bring to this school district. And I know you have a commitment to trust as well. The third reason I'm here, and it's the reason all of you are on this stage with me, is we have one responsibility, and that's to serve kids. You know, as board members, and I know as an administrator, we spend a lot of time thinking about adult stuff, okay? I do it all the time, and sometimes I catch myself and I'll realize all I've spent my whole day thinking about is tall people. When in reality, and you know this as board members, we got to be thinking about the little people first. And that's what I would bring to this school district. And that's why I think I'm a match for your school district. Because when we have decisions to make, we're going to make them collaboratively. We're going to build process. We're going to make the best decision we can. Sometimes it'll be a fully collaborative decision. There will also sometimes be snap decisions. Like almost all those safety decisions or decisions in a moment, those become final decisions you have to make. And I'm telling you, when I make those decisions, it's with a kid focus. It's how do we serve kids best? And if we're serving kids, then we're doing our jobs, whether we're a school board member, the superintendent, a teacher, or custodian. So that's what I would bring to this school district, a commitment to process, a focus on relationships, and the belief that when we make decisions that are best for kids, they're best for our school district. I'm excited to be here this evening. I'm looking forward to all your questions.
Thank you. Given your research on our district, what do you believe are the 2 or 3 most critical challenges that our district will need to address? And how would your background and skills help us address these challenges?
I think the first challenge is you're a relatively new Board of Education. Now, I know some of you have been sitting on this stage for a while. I understand that, but you do have new members and you're figuring yourselves out, and you are also in the process of a superintendent search. So you really have, we talk about what's the most important work you're doing. I think it's actually this week and next week. And then forming those relationships and figuring out how are we going to work collaboratively as an administrative team, as a superintendent, as a board of education. If you guys get that right, I think you're on a path that's really going to continue to lead Anchor Bay in absolutely the right direction. If you get it wrong, I think you're going to be really in a spot where you're not serving kids. So I see that really as your that's like the first challenge you have. And I think that I'm a good fit for that, for those reasons I explained just previously. When I think of the next thing that I see as an outsider, and recognize this is only through the lens of a guy who spent a lot of time watching school board meetings remotely, your recordings and all those sorts of pieces, and combing your website. I think that because of some of the hard decisions you've made and are going to have to make, changing superintendents, potentially closing a school building, COVID, all those sorts of things, those things can be really hard on trust in the community. And I think you're going to have to do those things well. You're going to have to do those things intentionally, transparently. It's actually interesting, when you make hard decisions, but you do it well, you can actually build trust and build confidence in the capacity of the organization very quickly if you do it well. And I think that it's a fit for me. The third thing mechanically, and you're experiencing it right now, I think you have to think about, and I think every school district's thinking about this, how do we handle student enrollment? Every district, including yours, has had a decline in student enrollment for two reasons recently. One is the pandemic has caused some people to make changes. Some people just redshirted their kindergartner, right? So they're holding them back a year, but we all know that affects our enrollment. Some people might be in the mode of, I think I'm going to homeschool my kid because I'm just not comfortable because of the COVID situation. Or maybe I want a different choice, maybe a private or parochial choice, or an all online choice, different than the one you offer. So you've lost some enrollment there. So we have to figure out, how do we get that enrollment back? And I'll tell you, every school district, including the one I'm currently in, we're having those conversations. I'm confident you guys are having those conversations too. The second thing you have to figure out, and it's why you're having these conversations around building closure, is what's the cause of long-term slow enrollment loss? Is it truly just demographics? Is there something more? Is there something less? Can we intervene in some way? Could we change how we do shared time? Could we more aggressively recruit? Could we look at different choices in schools of choice, the way we manage things? Those are all sorts of decisions I think that you're going to have to make, because we know in this state, because we have flawed funding system, it's all about pupils on an annual basis. And if you can't answer that well, then you're going to have financial problems. Every district is struggling with the reality that on this stage, I've never met any of you before, but think about this from this perspective. Almost all of your parents have more first cousins than you do. Like, I live in a 4-bedroom house. I have 2 kids. My wife and I are not adding any more kids to that, if that makes some sense. But my wife's mom has 7 siblings and 28 first cousins, and my dad's, you can keep going through the list, right? And that is the situation that demographics mean all of us are having fewer kids. Now, doesn't mean everyone has fewer kids, but a lot of people do. We also live longer. That's a good thing. Like, my mom's 81. I'm really happy that's what's working, but she's also stopping somebody from living in that house and contributing kids to that school district. So is it demographics that's impacting your enrollment? Or is it something more? Or if it's both, how can we ameliorate those things a little bit? I think those are conversations this district's going to have.
And what are the immediate challenges that you would expect to face given these? Tell us how you would hit the ground running on July 1st and ensure that we're fully prepared for a positive, productive school year.
So Mr. Silveri warned me that I shouldn't pass out my 90-day plan that I brought with me that I'm going to bring to you later, because if I give it to you now, you'll probably all half drop, it'll fall on the ground, and you've got little like kid tables, it won't fit, okay? So later on today, when you're at home, relaxing, you can look at it. But what I'm going to tell you right now, and let me get out my copy just so I can do it in order. The first thing that's going to happen is we have to have, for me, the biggest deficit I have is I don't know you and I don't know this community particularly well. I know it somewhat, I'm just as someone who's been doing research, but I don't know, I haven't been in many of your buildings. I've been on this soccer field a lot of times with my son, but like, I haven't been in your buildings. I don't know your people. So really I have to intentionally go about a process of meeting people and connecting with people. So you'll see in my plan of like, what are some of the things that I need to do immediately? It's form relationships and meet. So it's one-on-one with your administrators, your principals. Even though I wouldn't start arguably till July 1st, there isn't any reason I can't have a presence when it's appropriate, following the direction of the Board of Education and working with my current boss. Whether that's, stand in the background at high school graduation. You can learn a lot about a school district by standing at the back of high school graduation. Not at the front, not up there yet, but I can stand in the back. That'd be pretty interesting. Or attending this event or going to this PTO sort of meeting. So it's forming relationships, it's meeting with people, okay? I need to talk to each of you so I can understand you as individuals, individual board members, and then I can start to understand what makes you tick, and we can figure out how we can be a team of 8 people leading this school district. I need to work with the board president to put in place particular ways that we are going to communicate. What are your expectations for me? Like, how do you want the administration to communicate with you? What are my expectations for you? I would hope that we could have a weekly meeting with the president and the vice president every week to talk about what's coming up on the board agenda. What do you see happening? What's your role? What do you need from me, et cetera, those sorts of things. We need to make sure to continue the board training that you started with Melissa and the Metro Bureau. Once again, you're a new board, I'd be a new superintendent. We need to look to do those sorts of things. We need to figure out this summer, what are the positive ways we can face our community, help them understand that we've got this. We've got the return to school. Even if we have to close a building, even if we have to manage some of those difficult things, we've got this now and we've got this in September. Send your kids to Anchor Bay. We're ready to serve them. Those are the sorts of things that we need to do this summer. A deep dive so I can understand, because I don't know you very well yet. We need to get those relationship pieces in place, and then we need to bring people together to come up with a plan. We also have, and you'll hopefully have this done by July 1st, you're going to have a new budget in place. You're going to have all new collective bargaining agreements, because I know they all expire. I'll want to know, how are those, how do we put those in place? How do we make that happen? How do we make good on the promises we're going to make through budgets and collective bargaining agreements? That's another thing that I'll need to know more about. I won't do them because they'll be done, but I want to know more about them right away.
Good evening, Dr. Dean. My name is Patrick Green. I'm the Vice President, Anchor Bay Board of Education. So thank you for taking some time and coming in and visiting us tonight. I have a few questions, and then I'll circle back towards the end and have a few more for you, so hope you don't tire of me. Maintaining healthy relationships with school and community stakeholders is important to us as a board. Please share with us how you have gone about building and maintaining successful relationships with all the members of your school community you're currently serving.
I think 2 words would drive that. It's being open. So open people listen first, they talk second. And being present. One of the things that I've cultivated in every school district I've worked in as a central office administrator is I tend not to start my workday at my office. I tend to start my workday in school buildings. So I tend to want to, I'll schedule my meetings the afternoon for that reason. But I wander into school buildings for no particular reason inside of my school district. And I just have a presence. And I was thinking about that because I figured there'd be a question like this. So let me give you an anecdote. Earlier this week, I stopped at Pierce Middle School. It's one of our 3 middle schools. It was towards the end of the day, towards the beginning of the day, but it was right after the kids got in. So I wandered in, opened the door with my badge, wandered around the building, saw 3 or 4 teachers, just waved to them and talked to Carolyn in the hall. It's one of our music teachers. Said hi to Mike. He's one of our biology or middle school science teachers, teaches biology, right? Saw some kid struggling with his locker because it's middle school. It's how it works. You know what I'm saying? And wandered into the main office, saw Ann, the secretary, chatted with her for a couple minutes and said, is Sarah around? Sarah's the principal. And she said, no, Sarah's in a meeting. And I just wandered away. And you know what? The building didn't stop. The secretary did not hit the alarm and call the principal because I wandered through Pierce at least once every 2 weeks. I wandered through each of the high schools at least once a week, sometimes more often than that. And I think that's the first way you build relationships is by being present. And I'm fairly open as a human. I tend to be fairly high energy and jovial, which tends to make people feel pretty warm. And I ask a lot of questions versus telling a lot of things. And I think that opens people up to me. So that's the informal piece. The other thing is we have to build some structures. We have to build structures for the community. So how do you connect with community members? Yeah, you go to PTO meetings and do those sorts of things. But maybe it's appropriate. I've done this in other school districts, seen superintendents do it. Is it every 2 weeks, have an open coffee hour at this coffee shop, anybody can wander in? I have an open door. I will meet with anybody that wants to meet with me. That doesn't mean they'll always exactly like everything I have to say at the very end. Like you don't always get what you want, right? But you're always going to get heard. You're going to get heard empathetically. And I'll talk to anybody that wants to talk to me. You know, one of the things, whenever someone comes to a board meeting and they have something like they want to say and they want to get something off their chest, I almost always walk up to the audience member afterwards and say, you know what, I'm happy you came today, but you could always come to me first. You could just come on in, contact me, send me an email. I'll be happy to meet with you. I think that's how you start forming those relationships, by having presence, being open to other people.
All right, thank you. What are some examples of community activities in which you have provided your leadership, and how did that benefit your district?
I can think of two direct ones. We have, like many school districts, and this is really unfortunate, it's sad. We've had to spend a lot of time talking about school safety. And I think most school districts do, and it really depresses me to talk about school safety, but we have to do that. So one of the things is we formed a relationship. We have 6 municipalities that serve the Grosse Pointe Public Schools. That means there's 6 different police forces that do things differently. So we started bringing those police chiefs together on a regular basis. And out of that, we brought in a consultant, and we all sat down and kind of created a systemized safety plan. And that was bringing those community police officers in. So, you know, one of the advantages I have because of that is I've got all the police chiefs in my phone. So when something goes on and like something happens at a school, or I need help with something, I can just call Chief Jensen in the Farms, or I can call call Chief Poloni, and now at the Shores, used to be at the city, at the Shores, and ask him for something. So I think that's an example of a community connection made. Another area I can think of where I had a really impactful, I shouldn't use the same word twice in one sentence. I'm a recovering English teacher too. But the way I had an impact was we had a strategic planning process, and I was the co-facilitator of that. And what we did is we brought together a broad group of stakeholders, had planning meetings. So we would have these very intense 1.5 hour long meetings, because we knew that adults can really only sit for 90 minutes and do something, and then they have to do something else. And we built a collaborative strategic plan that had broad support across our community. So while that wasn't a true full-on community event, like I sat down with the PTO, I view it as a community event because we brought people in, all of our stakeholders, created this product that really drove our school district.
All right. How do we create a district-wide culture of continuous improvement to achieve the strategic outcomes that you mentioned in the previous question?
First thing you have to do is when you create the strategic plan, you have to have buy-in from your stakeholders. You can't create a plan in a vacuum, bring it to people, and expect that they're going to view it as their plan. So if this board and the new superintendent creates a plan and brings it to everybody, it will not work because it isn't their plan. So the first way to get the plan to work is that it has to be their plan. Now, everyone has voice. Everyone has a different voice, right? A parent has an opportunity for voice. A principal has an opportunity for voice. The board members have an opportunity for voice. Everyone's voice is different. Everyone's voice is valued, and some voices get final voice and some don't. But the first way to make sure that we are moving forward with a plan is to get everyone in from the beginning. Then we make sure that plan is a living, breathing document. The two things you do is when you make decisions, you make sure that they align with that plan. So like if part of your strategic plan is to have a commitment to early childhood education, it probably would make sense that when you're doing your budgeting, you would point some of your resources towards early intervening services for young kids, just as an example. Likewise, if part of your strategic planning process didn't have anything about expanding AP offerings for kids, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but let's just say like we intentionally decided not to do that, then we shouldn't align our activities or our resources towards that. So it is that alignment sort of piece. And then the second part of that is to have a regular check back. That works whether we're talking about the strategic plan. So like if we have a strategic plan, every 6 months or 9 months or 12 months, we should have a check-in. It should be public, where we talk about how the progress we're making on that plan. You're actually then modeling what you want for your employees too. Each of our teachers should have an individual development plan of what they're focusing on that year. And when they're being evaluated, it's through the lens of how are you doing with your goals. We would model the same thing with me. I would ask you as the Board of Education to work with me to establish some goals for me as a superintendent, and then hold me accountable on those goals. I would ask you, especially because we're new, to meet very regularly, not once a year. Like that would not be enough time. Like I would want to be meeting with you every 90 days in closed session, because that's an appropriate activity under the Open Meetings Act, for you to give me, give you a progress update on my goals, which you've seen before and helped me build. And then you give me feedback on how you think I'm doing. And because feedback has to be two ways for it to be authentic, then I would give you feedback on how I felt things were going and how I felt you were doing. Not like saying, John DeRue, you're a good board member, but like talking about how are we meeting our commitments with feedback. So I think that starts at the top with the strategic plan. It's modeled through the superintendent's evaluation. It's modeled through teacher evaluation. All those things are in place. They're all aligned the same way.
All right, for that anyway, right? Welcome to Anchor Bay, Dr. Dean. I'm John DeRue. I'm the treasurer of the Anchor Bay School Board. I'm going to ask you a couple questions here about political awareness. What is your biggest concern regarding the political climate of education in Michigan? And as our superintendent, how would you advocate for political action that benefits our district and public education throughout our state?
First, I like how you spell your first name. You're doing it right. The second piece of that one, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Our funding model in education is broken in many ways. Having a funding model that is based solely on enrollment that totally fluctuates, I mean, I realize we have a 90-10 split in a normal year towards our foundation allowance, is very problematic. It is then exacerbated by the budget cycle that we have set in the state of Michigan. This idea that technically by law, we have to have a budget by June 30th, but the state of Michigan doesn't need to have a budget by September 30th. And in times of divided government, as we have now, you will not have I don't believe you are going to have a budget by June 30th from the state. So how can you as a local have to make those decisions even though you don't know that, don't know what your budgeting is going to look like? That, I believe, is the single biggest political within the state issue in here. So how do we work through that? We really have to have advocacy. I am sure, I don't know because I've never worked in Macomb County. I imagine the MISD, which is very well connected, has lobbyists, has individuals that really are that advocacy piece. As a local superintendent, one of the things my boss does really well right now is modeled for me. It's one of the things I'm going to steal from him when I'm sitting in the superintendent's chair. He makes himself available to any reporter that wants to talk about anything. And every time he ends up talking to them, he talks about school funding, by the way, even when they want to talk about something else. And he also makes himself available to talk to any politician that wants to talk to him, whether it is the local mayor or it is the chair of the House Education Committee in Lansing. And I think that's a spot because I think the superintendent does kind of have that bully pulpit, to use the Teddy Roosevelt phrase, this opportunity to stand here and say, I represent these 6,000 kids, and that this is what these kids need. And I'll tell you, the first thing we need is a better and more stable funding system that is more predictable. So at the local level, we can make better decisions.
All right. What are specific ways in which our district should be working with other local districts to foster community partnerships?
One of the things, kids, especially when we talk about post-secondary outcomes, traditionally K-12 districts are fairly well aligned, and Anchor Bay is pretty good at this part, at preparing kids for like a college-based post-secondary environment. But it is difficult, even in a relatively large district like Anchor Bay, to have broadly robust CTE programming that crosses a variety of areas. So I know that you do have CTE programming. I'm not saying you don't, but I also know you are in consortium inside of Macomb County with some CTE activities as well. And one of the things that I think that every district should be looking at are ways to broaden those partnerships. Now, Anchor Bay does have some geographic challenges, and they're the same ones Grosse Pointe has. You're kind of tucked in the upper right-hand corner of your school district. I'm sorry, of your county. So that makes it a little challenging. We have the same problem in Grosse Pointe, you know what I'm saying? Because you're in the same county as Warren, but Warren is like, what, 9 left turns and 30 miles or so away to get there, right? So it's tricky, But I do think we should be looking at ways that we can partner with our local school districts. And I know you're doing some of this, but how can we try to make sure the districts close to us, so the Lands Cruises, Anchor Bays, the Romeos, how can we work as a group? Because we're all about the same size. We have a lot of the same interests. How can we advocate for more things for our part of the county? You might already be doing lots of those things. I transparently, as a non-Macomb County person, don't know the full answer to that. But those are the sorts of questions and cross-district advocacy pieces I'd be looking to at least ask questions about.
Okay. What impact has standardized testing and teacher accountability had on our education system in Michigan?
I think in general, teacher accountability is really important, and generally it's a very good thing. You know, we at the end of the day have a responsibility to kids. We are entrusted with kids as well as the kind of the money that goes along with those kids to support the organization. And holding our employees accountable for outcomes makes a lot of sense. If I'm your superintendent, I want you to hold me accountable for outcomes. And prior to the changes in the laws in 2011, teacher accountability in this state was not at the forefront because it really was something that was really entangled into the collective bargaining process, et cetera. Now it is outside of the collective bargaining process. It's actually a prohibited subject of bargaining. So school districts have an opportunity to build accountability systems. Now it kind of goes back to my first answer. Accountability systems are not about gotchas. If you treat them as a gotcha, you're going to break trust and you're going to actually ruin a lot of things with your employees. But from an accountability perspective for all your employees, not just teacher accountability, how can we ensure a clear evaluation system based on one of the 4 approved models from the state of Michigan that has clear check-in points, clear goal development, clear observations, clear feedback? People know how they're doing. The point of accountability at the end of the year is not for somebody to feel cheated or even rewarded. It's to get regular feedback on how they're doing their job. And I think that part is really good. The first part of your question, though, Mr. DeRue, was around the role that standardized testing plays inside of that. Transparently, in the time of COVID, I would be an advocate that it should not play a primary role inside of that because our standardized testing in the world of COVID does not work. I mean, we found that when we moved the NWEA to be completely online, done at home, our NWEA scores were completely they were completely unreal based on how they had been done previously. I know because your district went through it, my district did too. You just had all of your PSAT testing, MSTEP, work keys. This year, the state of Michigan didn't mandate kids take it. I don't know what your participation rate was. All I know is it was less than it typically is. So consequently, because of COVID, that sort of data does not have a lot of validity. And I'm saying validity with a mathematical bend to that piece. I do, though, think it plays a primary role in telling us collectively, are we as a school district doing well on our benchmarks? I think to drill down at the teacher level, given those things, doesn't make a lot of sense. But we can still look at how are we comparing with our peers? How are we comparing generally to previous years? It can kind of drive our understanding of our current state and where we're going.
All right, thank you.
This is Steve Middlestat. I'm the secretary of the board. I've got 4 questions. First one is, what is the most difficult situation you'd had to deal with in your educational career and how was it resolved?
I'm thinking because as the deputy superintendent, a couple things are coming to mind. I would talk about COVID, but I feel like I've talked a fair amount about COVID. So I'm going to avoid that as the most difficult thing. I'll talk to you about, okay, this is the most difficult thing. This is the thing that kept me up the most at night. Our school district about 2 years ago, let me back up. Our school district 5 years ago realized that our enrollment was dropping considerably for demographic reasons primarily. And as our enrollment dwindled, as we graduated more seniors, then we added kindergartners, and we all know how that math works as you go through the process. It became clear that we were at least going to have to talk about school building closure and potential reconfiguration. And we did bring together a broad group of stakeholders to have those conversations. So we brought together, I think it was about 60 people, teachers, parents, high school students, local politicians, community members, administrators, 3 board members, not 4, because we didn't want, even though it was an open meeting, we didn't want to have to put ourselves in an OMA box. And we met for about 3.5 months, actually probably 4, reviewing data, looking at our current state, looking at projections. And in our community, almost all of our school buildings were 80 years or older. So you were talking about closing potentially buildings that people's grandparents had went to, if that makes some sense. And in Grosse Pointe, our percentage of staff members that live in the community is over 60%. And our percentage of community members that grew up there is incredibly high. So my wife and I and our 2 kids have lived in Grosse Pointe for 23 years, and I am very clearly a new person and an outsider, because that's the nature of this community. And so to have those conversations about closure were incredibly painful, many hurt feelings. But the way we got through it, Mr. Millsad, is simply we followed process, we listened, we laid out, these are how we're going to talk about data. This is how we are going to make recommendations. We had some of the most creative, some of them grounded in reality, some of them grounded in fantasy suggestions, but we listened to all of them. We modeled all these sorts of things. So if you got into my Google Drive, find this whole folder of at least 50 different ways we could reconfigure our district with numbers and grade configurations, et cetera. We recognized at the end of the day that that was a board decision, and it was a board decision. It was something the board had to finally make. We did have to make an administrative recommendation, and we did that. Why am I highlighting that as one of the hardest things we had to do? Because I'll tell you, the hurt feelings it created were substantial, and there's something we're still feeling inside of our school district. But having said that, it was still necessary. I still think it was the right decision. You know, you can't measure was the decision right based on if it was a hard one or not. That's actually the wrong rubric. You have to go back to say, what's our strategic plan say? We're in the kid business. We have diminishing resources, so we're going to have to make hard decisions. And I don't like that we had to close 2 buildings and reconfigure things. In fact, it's probably the worst moment of my time as a deputy superintendent. But I am proud of the process we used. And while I dislike that we had to make that recommendation and the board had to make that decision, it was still the right decision. And I'm still comfortable with that decision having been made, even though I don't feel good that we have to make it. That probably made no sense. In my head, that made sense when I thought it through. So hopefully it made some sense to you.
Thanks. Often you need to lead without having official authority over some of the people involved. Have you been in that situation before in your career? And if so, how do you handle it? How do you lead a group of people?
You're exactly right. There's a perception, and I don't think it actually works this way for the most part, but like if you're the boss and you walk in the room, like, so if you walk into cabinet, which is what we call our executive administrative team, and you're the superintendent, you're automatically put in a leadership sort of situation. So like, it's pretty clear there's a hierarchy, all those sorts of things, but you're exactly right. The harder one is when you walk inside of a space and it isn't clear where the hierarchy lies, who's in charge, those sorts of things. I mean, I can think of some of the community task force I've been part of where I'm more of someone who was invited. So we had a mental health team that came together. We have 3 hospitals that are actually inside of our attendance boundaries, St. John's, Beaumont, and Cottage. And so we had a group of people from those 3 hospitals come together, mental health people, some of our public safety officers, school people, to focus on student mental health. So we had like a lot of counselors, social workers. I was there as the deputy superintendent. And one of the things that kind of happened was we had a person who brought us all together, and we got together for our first meeting and kind of looked at each other, and we realized there really wasn't a plan. Like, we didn't know what we were even there for. So one of the things that we did was I kind of worked with a couple of the other people in the room I knew well to put together a subgroup to plan the next meeting. So we had some clear outcomes, and we actually took people through like almost a mini strategic planning process for this group. And by going through that process, we were able to figure out what our 2 or 3 goals should be. I mean, our goal was to come together and help kids, but that's so amorphous. If you don't get it more targeted, you're just going to probably spin wheels the whole time. So I do think leaders come about by being good listeners, and who are people who are willing to do the work. And I listen and I'm willing to do the work. So, you know, you listen, you hear there's this need, and you can kind of say, hey, well, I could help you do that. That opens people up. They feel warm about that on the inside. They kind of like, well, I might want to work with that guy. Maybe we can get something going here. It's almost like pushing that boulder, like you're on a hill, you push the boulder, that first push is really hard. But once you start it rolling, you can really make some progress, if that makes some sense.
Thank you. What are the key elements needed to establish and maintain a good working relationship between you and the board?
I think it's relationships, and it's frankly understanding roles. The Board of Education has some things they have to do. They have to hire the superintendent. They have a final fiduciary responsibility. Their job under state law is to establish policies, make those sorts of big picture decisions. That's the role, to provide feedback to the superintendent. The administrators and the superintendent is the leader of that group. The district has the responsibility to make sure the policies are put in place, to make sure that the things the board takes action on are seen through. Administration has a responsibility to provide accurate, timely information to the Board of Education. I think any Board of Education has to know what its role is. I think the superintendent has to know what their role is. You know, at the board meeting, it's the board's meeting. It's not the superintendent's meeting. But the board has to understand what its responsibility is. And I think that comes about through training and through dialogue. You know, I think also you can have, especially when there's a situation where there's been leadership tumult, sometimes that can be new board members, sometimes it can be the loss of the superintendent, sometimes all those sorts of things. Everybody wants to step up. And sometimes when you step up, you step too far forward, and all of a sudden you're standing in somebody else's space. And that's uncomfortable for the superintendent. It's also uncomfortable for the board. You know, the superintendent doesn't do board work, and the board doesn't do superintendent work. And the only way we know what our work is to have clear dialogue ahead of time. What is your role? What are your expectations? And I think it's pre-planning. It goes back to, if I was hired as the superintendent, how can we spend July together? Heck, how can we spend maybe a little time in June together, figuring out what's the role? What's your role? What are your expectations for me? What do I need from you? What do you need from me? I think you're new enough. I know I'll be new enough. We probably both need a plan of like what our focus areas are going to be, what that role is going to be. We'll get in trouble if we're not clear ahead of time of what the role is. One of the things you're going to hear from me is, I believe strongly that superintendents should never surprise a board in public. If I come to a board meeting and I've surprised you, I have not done my job. Now, that doesn't mean I sometimes won't tell you something you don't want to hear. That's different than a surprise. I would also hold you accountable for exactly the same thing. If there's something on your mind, you've got to call me before that meeting. And it's not fair if I surprise you or you surprise me. And that is something that I believe firmly. And I'm not saying that because I think you've got a problem in that area. It's not what I'm saying at all, but that is one of the things that's really important to me. I've seen a lot of different boards and a lot of different superintendents, and you need to have a no surprises rule. I believe firmly in it.
Thank you. Given your research or what you know about our district, what do you believe our vision for the future should be, and how might you engage the entire district in pursuit of that vision?
I think the engagement piece, I think I've touched on a couple of times. I think it's, I'm sorry, I didn't cut you off. I apologize. Okay, if I missed if I accidentally cut you off, I apologize.
No, I mute wrong.
Okay, I understand. I appreciate it. We've all been on Zoom and all these things so many times. We've got skill sets we never even knew we had. I think, and I apologize. Could you read it to me one more time? That makes me sound incompetent, but do you mind?
Don't mind at all. Get myself unmuted here. Given your research of our district, what do you believe our vision for the future should be, and how might you engage the entire district in getting to that vision?
Okay. I can't tell you today what your vision should be. I do know you're a school district. You need to be committed to kids. You need to be committed to all kids. And if I was part of your school district and I was helping lead your strategic planning process, and that would be the process that determines your actual vision and determines how you're going to make decisions and like what your focus areas are going to be, I would tell you, I believe your vision needs to be about servicing all kids, providing guaranteed outcomes for students, for ensuring that the students that school doesn't always fit real well for, that Anchor Bay is a place where those kids can fit. I think that is critically important, and the best school districts figure out how to serve all kids. But that's pretty general, and I'm being transparent with you about that. I think what I would bring is not, here's the 5 things you have to do. You know, I've talked earlier, you've got issues with enrollment loss, stability. I know you've got, this year you've been running a budget deficit. I know you've put some things in place like your early buyout, et cetera, to do that. But I do have some deep questions about, is it ESSER backfill that's helping? Have you really figured it all out? I think those are all the questions we'll have to figure out. But I actually don't think that's the vision. I think the vision is we bring people together. What does this district want to be? Where do you want to go? You know where you're at now. You're a really very, very good district measured in lots of different ways. You're a community where people want to come and live. You're a community where people want to stay. You have great outcomes with kids. You have AP tests. You have CTE programming. You've got early childhood program. You have GSRP. You have these sorts of things in place. Do we need more of those things? Do we need different? Are those things all aligned with each other? Those are the sorts of things that strategic planning and vision crafting and mission developing and goal identifying would provide this school district. I think with a relatively new board and with a brand new superintendent, that's the first step. So it's not my vision. It has to be our vision. You know, what is Mrs. Knox's idea? Like, what's her input to this? It can't be at the end when we present to you some strategic plan and say, is this good or bad? I want you to be part of the process when we're building that, since you're building that plan. Though that's the sort of thing that we need to be doing collaboratively. So I'm sorry, I don't have one vision for you.
I'm Jill. I'm going to ask you 3 questions about instruction and curriculum. Please give us examples of educational change or reform that you have initiated in your current or previous positions that have led to improvements in student learning.
One of the things that had been going on in Grosse Pointe for quite some time was we had been providing resources towards people, which you have to do. You're a school district, 90% of your budget's people oriented. But we as a school district had not been intentional about providing enough professional development around targeted pedagogical practices in the classroom, as well as we had not updated our curriculum materials in quite some time. So like you go to Grosse Pointe South, which is like aesthetically, this very pleasing building on the, on the outside. It looks really nice. It looks like a college, but then our kids would be carrying around textbooks that were really outdated, which doesn't matter too much in certain subject areas. So like if the kids are reading To Kill a Mockingbird, that's okay if it's a version from 1965, because that's the same book that it is now. But if your science book is from 1987, we probably have some issues going on there. So when I think about the things that we've been able to do these 9 years in our school district is we've been able to, through collaborative work that had 2 parts. One was through the budgeting process, identifying budget resources to support the adoption of new materials. And the second thing was having a living, breathing, we call it EPLC. It's our Education Policy Learning Council. I probably mixed that one up, but it's basically our team of teachers and parents that approves and reviews our curriculum. We really ramped them up, and we have frankly purchased significantly updated and new curriculum materials inside of my 9 years in that district. Not because of me, like, please don't go there and say, well, John says he did all this stuff. I didn't. But I did recognize that there was a need there, worked with the budget process of getting that in place, worked with our directors of elementary and secondary instruction to say, hey, we need to go after this thing. And then, man, they went after. That's great work. The second part to that, second thing I'm really proud of, is at our elementary level, we're very committed as a school district to differentiated instruction. And when we think about differentiated instruction, which is individualized instruction that meets a kid's individual need, instead of saying, you're a first grader and all the first graders should be doing this, when we're in differentiated instruction, we recognize that in that first grade, we're going to have some kids that are reading a Harry Potter book, and we're going to have some kids that aren't sure how to like open the book or like manage through a book. And so if you're going to differentiate instruction, you have to change your practices. It isn't just buying new materials. So we became very committed as a school district in the last 8-9 years on the workshop approach. So we use Reader's Workshop, Writer's Workshop, and now Math Workshop to differentiate instruction for kids. And it's easy to say and hard to do. The hard to do is we can adopt a Reader's Workshop approach all day long, but you have to have intentional professional development. You have to align your assessments. So, if you're going to provide Reader's Workshop, which is where a teacher works with small groups, flexible groups of kids, kids are constantly moving in and out based on their own personal development. You have to provide teachers training not only on how to do that, but how to assess students so they know when the student needs to move up or move down, or provide targeted layers of instruction. We layered on top of that our MTSS approach, which is kind of the newer version of our new name for RTI, response to intervention, so that we would build in supports for our tier 2 and tier 3 students. So we use that as like that gateway. Readers Workshop was the gateway to our MTSS approach, which is then the gateway to our special education early intervening services to support students. It's a complete layered approach to differentiate our instruction.
Thank you for that. Kind of building on where you just left off. What do you believe are currently the biggest challenges with special education in our region, and how should these challenges be addressed?
I think the first thing, we have to recognize that our students with special needs they're each an individual. You know, we often talk about having programs for students with special needs. You might have, like my district, we are the Eastern region of Wayne County. We provide cognitively impaired self-contained classrooms and autism spectrum disorder classrooms for we have 24 of the ASD classrooms. We have 8 of the CI classrooms. We provide that in a consortium across multiple districts. And we offer those programs. But a really great special education department recognizes it's not the programs, it's the individual plan with the child. And when we talk about providing outstanding special education services for students, it's recognizing a couple of things. Every kid who qualifies for special education needs an individualized plan with individualized goals. Underneath that, they have to be placed in that least restrictive environment that supports their needs. And that is what parents want almost every time. I've never sat in an IEP with a parent who said, basically, I want my kid in a more restrictive environment. Almost always parents are looking for, how can my child get what they need? And from an equity lens, it doesn't mean the same thing. Getting what you need is getting what you need, not the same thing as the person next to you in each case. So that plan provides the kid what they need in that least restrictive environment possible. That's one of our biggest challenges inside of special education. You know, 13% of your districts in special education, right around there. It's pretty much true for almost every district. How can you create an individualized plan for 13% of your students? That's a challenge. The second thing inside of special education, it's one of the things that actually has me cautiously optimistic around some of the ESSERS pieces, is in this country, special education is massively underfunded. And that is a significant need that starts at the federal government. So IDEA, which is the federal law that governs special education, has never been fully funded by either the federal government or the state. And that is a significant challenge to local school districts just like yourselves. And that would be probably my second big challenge inside of special education. Under ESSERS, we're starting to see some of that money, and we're starting to see some dialogue change that the percentage that we get funded for special ed should go up. It should get itself to 100% for what it's worth. But it's starting to tick its way up, and I think that's probably a positive thing for school districts.
Thank you. How would you meet the needs of college readiness while also providing high-quality, relevant, career-focused opportunities for students?
I think this is something that Anchor Bay has a built-in advantage. Transparently, you're a single high school district, and your high school is pretty big. And by big, I don't mean just physically large. It is, and by the way, it's beautiful. But like, it's fair, you have all your kids in one space. That gives you economies of scale, so you can provide a wide swath of opportunities for students. So it starts with, in 9th, 10th grade, how do we start identifying what individual kids need? That doesn't mean track students. I'm actually a opponent of tracking students, significant opponent of it. But how do we provide high quality, high challenging instruction to each kid, and then identify relatively early on, especially by the end of their sophomore year, like which pathway do they think they're going to? So like if this kid in his brain has U of M in his pathway, how can we create AP opportunities? How can we create early college opportunities? How can we create dual enrollment opportunities so that when that student is getting their app reviewed in the winter of their senior year by the admissions counselor at U of M, how can we ensure that that kid had a rigorous and challenging curriculum? Because I'll tell you, having a 4.0 is not enough. You got to be able to identify that you took really high quality, challenging content. At the same time, if you build your entire district to meet the needs of your AP students, you will be missing the vast majority of your students. And so how can we use our career pathways? How can we use our CTE program? We all know that there is a significant need for college-educated young people, but there is a significant need for students in trades. There's a significant need for students with unique and specific skills. You know, many times you can go through a robust CTE program, through a community college partnership, come out with a certificate, an endorsement, some sort of piece like that, and actually be in some ways more well-positioned than the person who graduated from college with a psychology degree. I say that with a daughter who's getting a psychology degree. Okay. So, I mean, I think you have to look at those sorts of pathways, those sorts of opportunities. And then here's one other thing that I'm also a firm believer in. I believe fundamentally that every student should be taking at least 1 or 2 classes that are a little bit harder than their comfort level. I don't believe there are generally AP students and non-AP students. How can we figure out what's a rigorous class that you could take? So let me, by you, I mean, maybe that kid's not the traditional AP track. So one of the examples I would tell you, in both districts I've worked in recently, we did an analysis of which AP tests and classes are the most accessible. I'll tell you, it's not BC Calc. Like BC Calc is not very accessible, meaning you have to have taken so many other math classes starting in the 7th grade to get to BC Calc in your senior year. Like you can't just pop into BC Calc. But I'll tell you, AP Psych. AP Psych has almost no prerequisites. It's a semester versus a year, although you can make it a year if you want to like make sure you're helping kids through it. And how can we give every kid that AP Psych experience, even if they're not going to take the test? Because what you get out of going through a rigorous, high expectation course will help you, whether you are going to U of M, you're going to Wayne State. I say as a Wayne State graduate, you're doing something different. So that doesn't mean every kid should take AP Psych. Let's not make that the headline in the local newspaper, okay? But like, I do think we can have dialogue around how can we provide rigor to kids? How can we provide as an entryway opportunities for kids? Like we know AP Lang is more accessible than AP Lit. So how can we get more kids in AP Lang? Maybe when they're 10th graders, we could give them a slightly different version of your 10th grade American Lit class to better prep them for the writing portions that come out of AP Lang. So that's just an example of a way to do that.
I'm Dennis Richards, School Board Trustee. I have 4 questions for you around finances. What is your experience with millage renewals, bond proposals, and sinking fund proposals? What is the key to the success of such initiatives?
I'm writing that down because there were 4 pieces in there and I'll lose probably, I start talking and I lose track. So I'm going to start with the last part, Mr. Richards. One was the key. The key is transparency with your community. No one is going to vote to either renew a tax or add a new tax if they don't trust that you've been doing the right thing with the dollars you already had from them. That's the first thing. And when you look at whether it's new sinking funds or a new bond issue, millages are a little different. You look at the pass-fail rate of those items, it almost always goes back to, did you pre-plan? Did you not invent the bond issue 4 months before May, but 18 months before May? And I'm just picking on May because that's one of the months you can do a bond election. Did you have a broad committee, maybe a blue ribbon type committee that figured out what are your facilities needs? So even before you started talking about a bond issue, you said, okay, let's do a deep dive of our facilities. Let's get the right people in here and figure that out. Let's wander around the boilers in our district. Let's figure out what they look like. Let's articulate what the need is. Then we probably have to educate people on what are the ways we can finance that. A lot of people think, you know, they see Anchor Bay, you guys are a $60 million operation. Heck, you can find $500,000 to put in a new boiler here. We all know that we barely get enough money to run our operation, run our like day-to-day operations, let alone capital improvements, right? So you're going to have to educate your community on why in Michigan, our funding system is designed that you're going to go back to your voters on a regular basis and seek bonds and sinking funds because you are not provided enough resources to maintain a beautiful high school like this one. And you didn't get this beautiful high school without passing a bond issue, you know, so that's how that piece has to work. It's set up that way inside of the state of Michigan. What's my experience with those things? In Grosse Pointe, we have had a sinking fund that we have been, a 1 mil sinking fund that we have been renewing every 5 years. And really we found, it was in place when I got there. We've had no problems getting that renewed because we have very clear, transparent 5-year sinking fund plan. So like next year, we're going to do all 4 of our ball fields, our 2 softball fields and our 2 baseball fields at North and South. And those were on the list 3.5 years ago. So no one's surprised when we're going to have to spend 650 grand on each of those, because that's really what the cost is of putting in an all new turf field. Okay. If we hadn't been clear ahead of time, we would have people coming out of the woodwork, not the baseball families, but coming out of the woodwork saying, you're spending 650 grand per field on what? Why are you doing this? How are you doing this? But because we've clearly articulated ahead of time, and we do a sinking fund presentation every year, most often twice a year. This is what we did last year. This is what we're going to do next year. Nice thing is all these sinking funds and bond funds, as you know, are segregated funds. They're not in your general fund. You get a separate report on them from your auditors every year. So you're going to highlight, this is the sinking fund. This is how it looks different than your general fund. Bond issues, and I've talked about that. Grosse Pointe had passed one bond issue in the preceding 50 years. We'd had a couple fails. And in 2018, we passed a $111 million one. And that only happened because when the voters voted on it in 2018, we've been talking about it for 16 months. We had a facilities plan, a blue ribbon plan that I co-facilitated. We toured, and like I said, Grosse Pointe buildings, like Defer Elementary was built in 1928. I mean, it had coal chutes. We found old boarded over coal chutes in our basements, okay? We actually went through, I remember on those meetings, and my wife was behind me, remembers, I would go to those meetings dressed not like this. I would go dressed in like my khakis or clothes I was comfortable destroying, because we would take these tours and go to the subtunnels at Grosse Pointe South High School and walk through, because our community members needed to see that it looked beautiful on the outside, but underneath, we had an old high pressure boiler system that required us to have literally a person there 24/7 by state licensure. And if we could get out from underneath that and put in a low pressure boiler system, we could save on operational costs, because now I don't have to pay the high pressure operator boiler system guy to be there on Christmas Day. You know, so like it's about transparency. And I think that's that background. And I kind of do have a passion for school finance. You're picking up on that. Sorry.
Please describe your experience with budget development and financial management, including making difficult budget reductions.
It goes back to, we're going to take our priorities in our budget, align it with our strategic plan. We're going to say that these are the things that we've committed to doing, so we're going to have to put the resources there. And then we have to, in a very transparent way, make it clear how we spend our money. So there was a feeling in Grosse Pointe that we weren't as transparent enough as we needed to be in terms of how we spent our money. So we had a previous board treasurer that had a real passion for spreadsheets, and I have a passion for spreadsheets. It's kind of funny, actually. And so I took over our budget model and utility model, which got posted on the website on a regular basis, that literally tracked every cost inside of the school district. All the people costs, all your insurance costs, I mean, all those people costs, hard costs, all those sorts of things, very transparently. So we use that as a predictive model. It wasn't our budget, but it was to predict what would happen. And so when we would sit down and talk about, well, how much would a 1% raise really cost us? Or how much would we save if we cut this position or this type of position? We could do that very transparently. That was necessary at that time. The good news is we did such a transparent job with our budget process. We were actually able to walk away from that almost weedsy approach of transparency to still be transparent. But now, instead of having board meetings with 80 people screaming at us, well, we don't know what's going on in the budget, because we've been so transparent, we've been so clear about the things we're doing, we were able to take a slightly higher level, like you wouldn't be able to find that tool any longer on our website, but a much higher level look at our budget and our goals and how do we align that. How do we make the hard decisions? It's first figuring out what's our core mission. So if our mission's instruction, and if you want to say your mission is about keeping class size low, then you're going to prioritize that. And then what are some things that you're going to have to do differently? So I don't know if that was enough or more, or enough for the right answer, but it really does come down to transparency, working with people, helping people understand how you spend your money now so you can figure out how to spend it in the future, if that makes any sense.
What opportunities do you believe budget limitations present? In tough financial times, what are your top 3 priorities?
My top three priorities are high quality instruction for kids on an everyday basis, keeping kids safe, and keeping the great employees we have. That doesn't mean like keeping at all costs, right? But those are the 3 things that you have to be doing: focusing on student instruction, keeping kids safe. And at the end of the day, you're a great school district because of the teachers that work in this building, not because of the building. Now, at the same time, you can't let the building fall apart, or all of a sudden it's not safe and all these sorts of pieces. So there is that balance inside of that. But those really become your focus areas. Let me give you an example. We found out part of our budget process 4 years ago that we had an early childhood program, a fee-based, like a preschool-based program, where people would, for childcare reasons, do some things. And we found out that it was losing money. And it was a shame we found that out because we weren't doing a good enough job keeping track of whether we were making money or losing money. It was buried inside of our school service fund. So it was kind of, our latchkey revenue was covering up that our preschool program was losing money, like not covering up in a deceitful way, but like it wasn't transparent, right? But we started realizing we were losing money. But we had a part of our strategic plan was a commitment to early childhood education and providing services to kids. So we had to do this deep dive of how can we figure out exactly how we're spending our money there? How can we realign our fee structure, our pay structure? We realigned both of those, our service structure. So we expanded services in our high demand area. And we've ended up creating a more than self-sustaining program, but frankly, an early childhood program that makes a couple $100,000 every year. So it can support its capital needs and also actually send back some money in indirect costs back to the general fund. So it actually then supports the general fund. So that's an example of how we can take a problem, like an upside down program, figure out if it's important to us, and how do we bring it back and come up with a better way to run it in an efficient way.
This is my last question. What opportunities might you explore to raise additional revenue for the district? Have you had success in procuring additional funds for your district?
Yes, to both. What's the first way? Win at enrollment. How do we get more kids? In our school district, Grosse Pointe, we have a lot of privates and parochials. And we figured out how do we aggressively recruit, aggressively try to mirror some of the things that like the perceived value adds at those places. How can we make them value adds here? So one of the things that I'm really proud of, our school district has been, I'm not proud of this part, but it's demographics. We've been losing about 2% student population every year. Our private and parochials lost 37% in the last 6 years. They're going out of business. Pandemic changes that, I understand that. But that is a way. You want to grow revenue? Get more kids. There's another way to look at it. Are you maximizing schools of choice in a safe, appropriate way that doesn't undercut what's going on inside of your school district? There are ways to not do schools of choice. There are ways to do it appropriately, if that's what the will of the board is, and if you're comfortable with it. How are you maximizing your shared time opportunities? Are you maximizing GSRP? Are you maximizing collaborative opportunities? So like, for example, in our district, there was a need for early intervening services, which is age 0 to 2 services. So think Project Child Find, kids that are age 0 to 2 that have identified disabilities. And we as a school district have provided those services. We did a great job with it. Our county came to us and said, 3 other districts in our county need these services. Would you be willing to provide them? I said, sure, we'll be happy to provide them. Will you start fully funding all of ours? They said, that sounds like a deal. So now we were able to take all of our early intervening services, move them over to the county on a cost basis. We still employ all those people. We actually hired another 10 people to run the early intervening services in another school district, and they cover a part of my special ed director's salary. We moved over hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost, got extra money back. We provided better services to more kids. That's a win. So those are the sorts of things you need to be looking to do.
Thank you.
All right, sir. I've got your last 4 questions, and they're based largely around staff and personnel. How would you interact with other administrators in our district? How would you strike a balance between giving them the support they need, as well as the autonomy to lead effectively while holding them accountable as necessary?
First thing you have to know, Mr. Green, is you have to know them as people. I had to have recently a conversation with an administrator. I found that they'd made a decision I didn't understand. And it was a pretty emotional decision, I could tell. And they called me late at night with this thing, and I figured out, okay, I can tell they're pretty emotional. It was around 9, 10 o'clock at night. It wasn't the right time to have like a reflective conversation. So we figured out how to start the day. And then that next morning, I wandered over to their building. We sat down socially distanced, face to face. And I just said, okay, tell me what's going on. And I did a lot of listening. And then I asked them some questions. I said, okay, so this thing happened. Would you do anything differently? You know what? They had a list of things they would have done differently. And their list looked a lot like the list that had been in the back of my head. And I never had to give them my list because they had the list already. And they figured out, they even said, they're like, John, I think I should have, instead of jumping right to an emotional response with the employee, I should have listened to the employee. I should have set up another time to talk to them. It was one of those sorts of like heat of the moment things. This principal already knew what they could have or should have done differently. And that principal is going to do it differently next time, not because I told them, but because they figured it out and articulated it to me. That's, I think, how you do that piece. So when I'm checking with administrators, I'm checking on them as people. I know the spouses' names. I know how many kids they got. I'm checking on them personally first. I'm asking them, what's going on in your building? What's something that I need to know? What's the point of like the pressure points going on inside of your building? A lot of times I ask them a lot of questions about how they think I'm doing, because people like to talk about that stuff. Like, okay, the board, as you know, this year, we've got this COVID-19 plan, and we're offering, a couple months ago, we were offering hybrid instruction. We're offering hybrid instruction. Tell me, principal at this high school, how is that working? What do you see as going well? And, how do you think we should have done it? And just by starting those conversations, we can get to a better understanding of where we're at. The accountability piece, I've talked about that. That's through goal setting, regular feedback, and honest feedback.
All right. My next question for you, sir, is please describe your most successful experience in building a high-performance team at work.
Through just a series of fortunate events, the entire HR office, except for me, ended up turning over in the space of like 9 months. Just one of those things. Somebody got a promotion job to another district. One of the support personnel got a job in another spot in the district. Another person got a job somewhere else, and somebody retired. So all of a sudden, you had 3 new support personnel, a brand new director of HR, and me, and we were all just staring at each other, and we had this whole pile of work, and we had to figure out how to get it done. In the previous environment we were in, we were very siloed. Everybody had a particular role. So we had one secretary that dealt with the hourly people, another secretary that dealt with the salaried people, another secretary that did all the sub-calling, one that dealt with payroll to make sure action sheets got done, et cetera, et cetera. The director of HR had dealt with all the hourly people. I dealt with the salaried people. And we sat down together as a group a couple times, and we said, okay, how do we want to do our work? Like, what work is of most interest to us? How do we best do this? One of my beliefs is I think silos tend to be very inefficient. So I wanted to figure out, how can we get the 3 people working in the office in a more generalist view, where they all have clear roles, but they cross-train so they know how to do each other's jobs. So if somebody's absent or someone needs support. We actually previously had 3 individual desks with these big like credenzas, so you couldn't even see people. Well, we were going to get rid of those. So we actually had more of a bullpen sort of look. We were all together in this, all the office staff were all together in one space. Nicole, the director of HR, and I both had an office right off of that, so we could all keep our doors open and listen and see what was going on and support each other. And we really built up this team where they felt that they owned the work. We were all fairly cross-trained. We did some relationship building pieces, and I'll tell you, the 5 of us have been rolling right along now for 3.5 years, and it is going really well. And I think we're a really great team. I mean, we're not like a great team, we're gonna win the baseball field, but I mean, we're like a really good team of 5 people that cares about each other, gets a lot of work done, frankly, has some fun doing it too.
If I were to talk to your president of your teachers union, how would they describe you to me?
John Dean is direct. I know where I stand, he would say that. I would share with you, and I'll pass this out later. One of the 3 letters of recommendation I'll pass along is from our previous Grosse Pointe Education Association president. He stepped down voluntarily. He still teaches in the district last year. We do have a newer president who's new to that role, and he is advocating for his members. That's his job. What's my hope for a relationship with all of my union presidents is to be very honest. It's kind of like I said to you before, there's no surprises. Like at the bargaining table, I don't do surprises. And I don't do gotchas. So if a teacher, for example, if I think a teacher has done something that's inappropriate, assuming it's not a safety thing, I call the president first and I say, hey, Chris, here's the situation. I need to talk to this person. I know that under their Weingarten rights, I don't actually even have to do that, right? Like I could go and they have to affirmatively assert their Weingarten rights. I don't do that. I call the union president and say, Chris, I need to talk to this person, or the principal needs to talk to this person, and this is why. If you want to be there, we'd be happy to have you there. You're in listening, supporting mode. And that goes a long way. So Mike Rennell, and I think he wrote this in the letter for me, said John plays it straight and John doesn't do surprises. And that means sometimes John has to give hard messages, and that's okay because it's done with basis of a relationship. It's done very directly and it's very honestly, and it treats them with dignity and respect. Doesn't mean we agree on everything all the time. We don't. Unions have an interest in advocating for their members. That's their responsibility, both under the law and I would argue morally. They're doing their job. Your job as the board and administration's job is to advocate for the kids in the community, which would include the teachers, but it's not exclusive of the teachers or any other bargaining unit.
And then the last question, sir. What would you suggest in terms of a comprehensive professional development plan for our educators? Specifically, what would be the key priority areas as well as the delivery system?
First thing is a comprehensive professional development plan needs to be sustained professional development. It can't be this thing this week or this thing this month, or this administrator went to this presentation, saw this really neat thing and shares it with everybody. One-off professional development does not work for people. Okay, it does not create systemic change. When you talk about changing what goes on in the classrooms, one of the hardest things to do, you have to identify job-embedded professional development, where there's an actual coaching model going on, where the person who's being coached knows what the targets are, what the goal is. So like if we're going to implement guided reading, for example, we're going to have to provide training on guided reading. That hopefully would be, we'd have a trainer or trainers model where we have some experts from within the district training their peers, like presenting, et cetera. Then we have to start providing the teachers in this case, feedback on how they're doing. Some of that feedback is evaluative, but that's not the first feedback. The first feedback has to be coaching. Principals can provide coaching. Not every piece of feedback from the principal is evaluative. It should be coaching first. We can also have coaching from our peers. We can also bring together our first grade teachers at this elementary school that are all working on guided reading, and they can talk to each other about how it's going. They can progress monitor that. And then we need to come back and provide further sustained professional learning. It's about being sustained, aligned with the strategic plan, job embedded, and hopefully coached from within. Most of the time you can pull that off.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we're doing fairly well on time, so if you would like to take a minute now and you could ask the board any questions that you might have for us.
I guess I feel like some sort of digital stalker because I've seen all of you on the screen like a lot in the last month or two, and I've seen a lot of your website and all these sorts of pieces. But in the world of both ethics as well as in a virtual world, I haven't been to your buildings, right? Except for when my son plays soccer and back, but that's a fall thing, okay? And by the way, he's not happy I'm here. He's like, Dad, why would you go there? And then he started telling me all these yellow cards from his freshman year. And I said, okay, no, it's okay. But I guess I want to know, what's something I wouldn't know about Anchor Bay by stalking you on your school board meetings, reading what's in the newspaper, and checking out your website? Like what's under the hood that like would be interesting or important for me to know?
I'm going to allow if any of the board members would like to jump in and offer their opinion.
Yeah, Madam President, I'll take that one out. I think one of the things I've been in the district for 17, 18 years now, 2 kids nearly graduated. The pride that the parents have in this district and the can-do attitude and we want the best for our students and our athletes is something that I've never really seen. And I spend a ton of time in other districts by the nature of what I do. When I say a lot of districts, I'm probably 25, 30 districts that I'm intimate with, if you will. And I don't see the passion like I see from Anchor Bay parents. And sometimes it's hard to quantify that because they want what's best for their kids, athletically and educationally. And we're tasked, the 7 of us, with trying to meet those demands, which sometimes is a little bit difficult.
If I could add on to what Mr. Green said, we have a small town feel with a massive district. And like you said, with the passion, and it does extend beyond the parents, the students, the staff, all the way into the community. Every small business around here supports us. There's just this really strong sense of community wherever you go, whether you're at a football game, a choir, concert, We have an award-winning band that's massive. Wherever you go, there's just this sense of community and camaraderie across every program, sport, whatever. So, but it stretches way out, even if people who don't have kids that go here, but are, you know, maybe more mature community residents, they're still involved.
I'd like to, Steve Middlestate, I'd like to add a comment also is that I believe that the district, and as you know, that it takes a teamwork to make things happen, and it's not just the teachers, the administrators, but it's everybody, support staff, everybody pulling together, and you don't get to the top of the county and test scores just by accident. It takes a lot of work, but it's a lot of support by all the different people within the district working together, and that's we came a long way. We've come a long way in the last 10, 20 years in terms of being the little rural district, farm district up in the corner of Macomb County. And we're still not the largest district, but we've been able to accomplish a lot in getting ourselves to a top level academic place because we've focused on curriculum and supporting our staff and supporting the people that work here, and they recognize it. And I think the community also recognizes it as you don't get all these bond issues passed. You don't get to build a big high school, and you don't get continued support without the recognition that things are going well and people are working together.
All right, thank you. So we do have a couple minutes remaining, about 5 or so. Is there anything you would like to add in closing for the board?
First, it's a sincere thank you. Board members don't get to hear that often enough. You guys are doing really heavy work, really hard work. I want to thank you personally for welcoming me here today. You know, it's always awkward and difficult when you're looking for a superintendent because it's kind of artificial and it's in public, which is a good thing, but it's still kind of artificial. That's like not the normal way you meet people, right? It's almost like, I've used this analogy before, and people are going to laugh and everybody knows me and sees this video. It's a little bit like trying to date somebody, but starting with Thanksgiving dinner, right? That's a little hard, okay? I remember the first Thanksgiving dinner I had with Sally, and that was hard, right? But that was months into a relationship. And here it is the first time we're at Thanksgiving dinner, right? And I guess, so I have a sincere thank you to all of you. And then we add into this whole distance thing with COVID, and I couldn't shake any of your hands and all these sorts of things. It just feels awkward. Having said that, I feel good about today. I feel like I enjoyed my time. So even if we never see each other again, and by the way, I hope we do see each other again, I view this hour and a half I've spent with you, I value that. I think in listening to you and listening to the questions you've asked and listening to the responses you've given me, looking at even some of the nods some of you have given me, like not like this knowing nod of, yeah, John, you got this, but like, oh, I thought I saw a couple times, like, that was kind of what I was thinking. Like, sounds like that guy kind of got close to what I was hoping to hear, right? I think, in fact, I'm pretty confident, you're the ones that really, your confidence matters more than mine on this one, that I would be a good fit for your school district. I'm a relationship guy. I'm a passionate, high energy person. I think you need somebody to be the face of confidence in this district, face of caring about this district, a face of transparency and honesty. Not that you don't have those things, but like, that's, I think, what if you want those things, I end up becoming that person for you. I'm a relationship person who cares a lot about process, doing things the right way so we have the best chance of getting the right outcomes. You have great process, you still get bad outcomes sometimes, but great process will give you the best outcomes you're going to get. And I'm committed to making great decisions for kids. You have a responsibility for about 6,000-ish, a little less, 6,000-ish kids. And I know that. I don't sleep at night when I don't think things are going well in my school district. I imagine all 7 of you are that same way. That's why all 7 of you decided to give up your time and run for election and get beat up on Facebook and get here anyway, right? And I'd like to be part of this journey with you. I hope you call me back. If not, I've enjoyed my hour and a half. I really have. So thank you all very much.
Okay, Dr. Dean, we appreciate your interest in the superintendent position for Anchor Bay. The board is interviewing 5 candidates this week, and we'll let you know Friday night where you stand in our search process. But we thank you for your participation in the first round as well.
Thank you. Would it be acceptable, Mrs. Brookmeyer, if I passed, maybe I get them to you, or I can pass them along, it's up to you guys. I brought plans along with letters of recommendation from a couple of people. Is that reasonable?
Yep.
Okay. Let me mask up.
Okay, at this point, we will take about a 15-minute recess, and we will return and begin our second interview with Mr. Todd Bidlack. Go ahead, Tim. Okay, we're going to come back to our meeting at 7:16. And at this time, on behalf of the board of Anchor Bay School District, I'd like to welcome Todd Bidlack to the interview for superintendent. Mr. Bidlack is currently the Assistant Superintendent of Learning Services for Bloomfield Hills Schools. I will remind everyone of our format. We may take up to 90 minutes. There will be 24 questions from the board. Toward the end of the interview, time permitting, we will give the candidate an opportunity to ask questions of the board and make a closing statement. And we will let you know if time is becoming an issue and there's a need to pick up the pace of response. As the board hears from each candidate and weighs this critical decision, it will be doing so through the lens of the candidate profile that was developed with considerable input from our stakeholders. Our intent is to identify the candidate that best fits this profile, which board members have at hand. Audience feedback may be submitted by those who are present on the form located at the table entrance in the auditorium. Those participating virtually may provide feedback electronically by the way of the link provided for this purpose. Although the task of choosing our next superintendent is the responsibility of the Board of Education, as the elected representatives of our community, we value and consider the input of our stakeholders in the process. Welcome. Mr. Middlestat, are you there as well?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. That's Mr. Steve Middlestat is joining us virtually. I'm Lisa Berkmeyer. This is Mr. Patrick Green, Mr. John Giroux, Mr. Dennis Richards, and Ms. Jill Knox. We are ready?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Bidlack, while we have had the opportunity to review your application materials, audience members here and those viewing from home have not. Please briefly review your background and share what causes you to be interested in this position at this point of your career.
Well, Madam President, thank you so much for the introduction. And actually, first, I'd like to just start by thanking the Board of Education for inviting me here this evening for such a wonderful opportunity to interview with you and talk about something that I'm really passionate about, which is teaching and learning. I'd also like to thank the members of the community of Anchor Bay and the Anchor Bay staff for perhaps either they are supporting the meeting here tonight with the logistics. I mentioned earlier that Amber and Tammy make a wonderful welcoming party as you come in and took very good care of me. And also for those that might be listening in, the process to choose your next superintendent is a very important one. And it takes quite a bit of time and involvement. And it's always extremely helpful when the community helps participate in that process and provide you feedback. Also, I want to take just a moment to recognize whether you're a bus driver, whether you work in maintenance or custodial staff, a para or teacher, all the people that work behind the scenes, as well as the Board of Education, that this last 13 months has just been absolutely extraordinary. And just want to thank everyone for their commitment and their energy throughout this year. And lastly, I just want to Also thank my family for their support and their patience for the demands of my career. And if they figured out how to find the link, I'm sure there'll be a little commentary by the time I get home and maybe some critiques. So I'm hoping not to give them too much material for later on this evening. So as you suggested, let me just start by taking a moment to share a little bit about my background and to try and offer how that has helped uniquely shape my experiences that has really brought me here this evening to interview to be your next superintendent. I grew up here in Michigan in the Lansing area, and in fact, it was in a school district not unlike the profile of Anchor Bay School District in this area. There, I was extraordinarily fortunate that my parents probably made one of their best mistakes, which was to buy a very modest home in a school district in which they could not afford. And like many parents during that time, they really struggled to make ends meet. And that often meant that the lights were out, or perhaps there wasn't a lot of food, or that we were struggling to maintain possession of our home. But what I did have is I was surrounded by an incredible school district with rigorous programming, with teachers that really cared. I can remember Mrs. Anderson, who always happened to have perhaps an extra sandwich in her lunch if she felt like I was hungry, or another teacher that decided to move me in advanced courses to kind of help push me along. In fact, I don't even think he reached out to my parents. I think he just put me in some of the advanced math courses during that time. My coaches, really that entire community really allowed me the opportunity to excel and achieve, in which, had my parents not made that choice, could have been a different outcome. And it didn't stop there. I've been supported and surrounded by incredible teachers throughout my career. I could think of Mr. Gittner, who was one of my elementary teachers when I was a principal, studying neuroscience and education, working with him on that, and the amount of new insights we came into. Just based on that research, there's been an extraordinary amount of incredible people that I've had the fortunate opportunity to work with. After getting my bachelor's degree, I really started with my first teaching job at Oxford Middle School. And before that, I was really kind of working my way through school, through tool and die. And luckily, I had a little bit of a knack for programming CNC machines and doing a little bit of mill work. And that really helped me not only work my way through school, but also helped me bring some of those practical experiences into the classroom. I also had opportunity during that time to be a wrestling coach and a football coach and a robotics coach. And during that time teaching, as I kind of grew through that position, I started to realize that I had an interest in leadership as well. I pursued a master's from Eastern Michigan University in educational leadership, found myself heavily involved in school improvement processes and as well as curriculum adoption. From there, I found myself in the opportunity to be the assistant principal, and then quickly after that, I moved on to be the elementary principal in Dryden. And Dryden was an incredible opportunity. It's a very small district, so there was only 2 administrators at the time. And from that position, after the high school principal retired, I found myself as the K-12 principal, and I would actually travel between both of those buildings throughout the day. From there, I ended up becoming the principal of Sasheville Middle School, which is probably one of the largest middle schools in the state, and is located in Clarkston. And there, when I came into Sasheville, they had experienced a couple of rough transitions and were really looking for somebody to be able to put the team back together and build a more supportive culture. I quickly began doing that exact work, bringing that school team back together, as well as starting to dive into some work around cultures of thinking and how to foster one's intellectual character. And that particular body of work piqued the interest of a nearby district. And then after a quick recruiting process, I found myself as an elementary principal in a neighboring community of Rochester. There we jumped into similar work around Project Zeros and cultures of thinking. And in fact, I'm really proud of the work in which we explored and pushing pedagogical research to the point that it's highlighted in one of Ron Richard's books, Creating Cultures of Thinking. There's a chapter in there dedicated to a couple of the teachers that worked within that building around language use and a few other pedagogical pieces. During that, I was also working on my specialist degree in educational leadership and earned that from Oakland University, and then moved into the position of my current role as Assistant Superintendent for Learning Services in Bloomfield Hills. In that role, I'm directly responsible for all the schools and their operations, as well as all building administration, the technology department, student services, and then of course, I also help with negotiations, budget processes, and other large projects as well. And that brings me here. And probably my most important role is being the father of two boys. Next year, my oldest is going to be a senior. My youngest is going to be entering into high school, and it's a really exciting time for that as well.
Given your research on our district, what do you believe are the 2 or 3 most critical challenges our district will need to address? And how would your background and skills help us address these challenges?
Well, the first one that comes to mind after reviewing all of the transparency reporting on the budget is that there appears to be a struggle to maintain a healthy fund to equity balance. And that is important for the stability and sustainability of the district. Looking through that, first I want to commend your CFO on the level of audits and the information that's in there. It looked like those reports are being put together very, very well, yet the district is struggling to maintain those revenue sources and be able to balance the budget in a way that would create a more healthy fund equity. I see that with the strategy of CTEs, that's likely helping sustain some of that a bit, but I do think that looking at those opportunity for additional revenue sources, as well as being creative around the structure of budgeting throughout the year, what that might look like. And that would probably be one of the challenges that I would look to engage in first. And I'm sure that you might be thinking right now, well, coming from Bloomfield Hills, such an affluent school district with a foundation allowance is higher than Anchor Bay, that I might not have experience in that. But actually, Bloomfield Hills is the only district that I've worked in where it hasn't been cash strapped. In fact, the other districts that I worked in had very similar experiences. In fact, especially I was in those districts during the financial crisis and rolling back some of that foundation allowance. So while in Clarkson, I was on the leadership team to take a look at overhauling the budget to be able to take some corrective actions and being able to do that in a very responsible way, where also we're able to be innovative within some of those changes and implement new strategies such as around multiple tier systems of support of how we would provide services for children, while also trying to right size based on the economic climate at the time. Another one of those areas that I noticed in your budget was around facility use, and it appears as though you are doing an incredible job with bond structures that allow you to keep the facilities up to date and to keep that from being too much of a burden on that general fund. Taking a look at that opportunity, as well as looking at some of the other bond structures, such as a sinking fund, if that's in place, what are those dollar amounts? How are those getting allocated? How can you draw away other expenditures from that general fund to be able to preserve that for programming and for experiences for our children? Another area would be, which I wouldn't describe as a challenge, but it's a challenge everywhere, which is to always, through an ongoing process, really focus on pushing pedagogy. looking for those innovative practices within the classroom, as well as the type of experience you want children to have throughout their entire trajectory, and being able to look at the support systems in place that really empower teachers to be innovative and drive those type of practices. So that's not a particular challenge where it would be a perceived weakness, but rather that would be some of the most engaging and fun work that we could do together as we partner with teachers to continue to explore that. You know, almost through the process of a continuous improvement process, that we are always looking for new insights in education and to be able to move those practices forward. And then the most obvious one, if I was going to put a third on there, is continuing to manage the crisis of COVID, making sure that we're prepared for next year, making sure that those that the protocols are in place, or if they need to be adjusted. In fact, in my 90-day plan that I have for you this evening, I outlined some of those pieces, and I've talked about 3 of the objectives that you'll find in there. One on budget processes of how to move into those areas to really kind of do a diagnostics of where we're at and look for opportunities to see if we can't make that a healthier fund equity balance, as well as some of those budget processes in place. Also, in my 90-day plan, you'll see that I have a strategy to where I'd be able to be introduced into the ongoing work in the classrooms right now in a very collaborative fashion of almost taking like a state of instruction. You know, being able to get pulled into how are we prioritizing student experiences and what's working well right now? Where would we not start? Let's not move into areas that are already extraordinary here at Anchor Bay. And then the third one in there you'll see as one of my first objectives is really taking stock of COVID and making sure that we're touring the facilities, that everybody has what they need, that we have adequate space, that we're going to be able to navigate next year successfully. One of the things that I'm doing in my district right now is really pushing on the CDC guidelines around the 6-foot distancing for identifying kids that need to be quarantined if they've been exposed. But really what we're seeing is a significant amount of evidence that transfer in the classroom is probably one of the safest public places to be is not occurring. So gathering that data, I was just meeting on that today to be able to house that in one location so we can have that ready every single day, that we can take a look at how many students have been quarantined, and those students that have had exposure based on the CDC guidelines, how many of those within the next 14 days actually got COVID from the classroom setting. And so I think it's going to be important to really kind of know those numbers by the end of this school year to be able to track that, because if the CDC does not change those guidelines, it's going to be a very tough decision, and we'll want data to be able to back that up on whether or not we would move into next year following that same type of practice. So hopefully it kind of gives you a couple of the ideas that I would want to be engaged in first, around like 2 to 3 areas that I might prioritize.
Thank you. But what are the immediate challenges you would expect to face? And given these, tell us how you would hit the ground running on July 1st and ensure that we are fully prepared for a positive, productive school year.
Okay, so I'm going to try really hard not to talk about COVID, if that's okay, because I feel like that's part of every conversation, just about every conversation I've had. And so tonight, I'm not going to go for the obvious one. Of course, we would take a look at that, but I think the most significant challenge is not already working here in Anchor Bay, and making sure that I'm building trust, that I'm reaching out to multiple stakeholders, that I'm engaged with our cabinet team, that I am engaged with our building administrators, our teachers union, our teachers, being visible. And that's hard to do right now with COVID protocols, but making sure that that is really priority one, is to establish those trusting relationships and being able to foster that along the way. That'd probably be my first area. And in my 90-day plan, one of the objectives specifically spells this out with some strategies. And the first one of the strategies in there is even to get input from the Board of Education on what are some of those external stakeholders within the community that you might be able to help me prioritize, that I might want to reach out directly to first, to start gaining a better understanding of the community and how best to engage, as well as be able to support the educational environment for our teachers, administrators, parents, and students.
Good evening, sir. My name is Patrick Green. I'm the Vice President of the board. And you gave me a great segue into my question, talking about community and stakeholders. Maintaining healthy relationships with the school and community stakeholders is important to us as a board. Please share with us how you have gone about building and maintaining successful relationships with all members of your school communities.
I would say a couple things come to mind really quickly, and that is to be engaged, to be available, to be honest, have integrity, follow through with what you say and promise. And transparency as well, and making sure that that's available. And giving your honest thoughts about something. Oftentimes too, if I'm working with someone specifically that may not be knowledgeable about education, really trying to make sure that my language use is at a level that can be understood, that I'm not getting too far into the weeds, that maybe something gets lost. And as well as trying to do that, also offering when something might be a little bit more of my opinion as opposed to research, or maybe just based on experience, so that people can really put that into perspective. One of the things I always encourage is I want to know where you disagree. Do you have another perspective? I think it's incredibly important to always be considering multiple perspectives. In fact, it's one of the global competencies that we would want for our children as they grow through our system, is to really understand multiple perspectives, to be able to, because that's really going to help you in a decision-making process. And as you gain those multiple perspectives, it also allows you to know how to introduce an idea or the implementation of an idea back to specific stakeholders, because there could be a different lens or a different opportunity with one initiative that different stakeholders would experience in a different way. So I really think it's important to be able to do that work in a fair, honest, transparent way, as well as collecting a lot of feedback. And probably the greatest strategy in there is to really listen. Are you asking more questions than what you're trying to deliver in a message? So if it's that type of opportunity for feedback, really making sure that you're pausing, that you're listening, that you're asking questions that are really going to get to the heart of an issue. And that's going to help you shape your understanding and be able to consider that when making decisions.
What are some examples of community activities and what ways does this benefit your district?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the middle of that. I heard the beginning and the end, just not the middle of that.
Well, don't they say those are the two most important parts, the beginning and the end, the middle is just kind of minutia?
Yes, but I feel like if I answer that, I could completely go off in a different way than what you were intending.
What are some examples of community activities in which you have provided leadership, and in what ways did this benefit your district?
The first things that come to mind are the coaching opportunities that I've had throughout my career. That is direct involvement where you're seeing an outcome once a week and being a partner with families through that experience. But to take that to another level, some of the examples I might include are around very significant bond initiatives, both in Rochester and in Bloomfield Hills. While in Rochester, I was asked to lead with one other person in the district, all the community stakeholder meetings that we had structured to be able to do a facilities review and master property planning around that. So myself and the technology director designed all the meetings, and throughout that process, we were also trying to model instruction, that you would experience discourse through a way that we would want to see in our classroom. And as a result of that, bringing the community together, being able to lead that type of dialogue, that turned into a successful bond initiative that helped improve all of those facilities. And I think that bond initiative passed at like high 60%, maybe close to 70%. And it brought $185 million into the district to be able to invest back into those school buildings. When I arrived in Bloomfield Hills, I was very surprised on the conditions of the facilities. Probably most of you would think that Bloomfield Hills would have facilities just as beautiful as this. And while their high school is a nice facility, all the other buildings were really built in the mid-50s. They were quick construction for baby boomers and had little investment since then. And as a result of that, it started to pull on the way students were cohorted. So like we have one middle school that has 4th through 8th grade students, another one that has 5th through 8th grade students, and it's really leaving the elementaries disconjointed. It doesn't mean that bad decisions were made, but rather choosing the best buildings to pull in and can house students was a good strategy based on facilities. And then tearing down some of the old elementary schools, because at some point you probably have been involved in that. At some point you can reach a stage where it is cheaper to build a new building than it is to bring an old building up to code and today's standards. So that's a little bit what they were faced with. This was probably one of the most significant limiting factors that I identified moving into the district, because people really underestimate the physical environment as being a cultural force that's within the classroom. There are several cultural forces that are always present, but the physical environment is one of those as well. And taking a look at that, within a year's time, we decided to start doing a similar process that I was able to draw back from in Rochester, and designing similar stakeholder meetings to engage the community, to allow the community to build the district that they felt was right for their kids. And engaging into that process in a very transparent way successfully led to the passage of a $200 million bond in which all the K-8 facilities are going to have significant improvements. So reducing and reconfiguring ourselves from 3 middle schools to 2 middle schools, moving all the elementary students back into elementary buildings, but making sure that those facilities are adequate for that. That took quite a bit of work with the community to land on and restructure to the point where neighborhoods could be affected by that in terms of the school that you're assigned. But at the end of the day, that passed with overwhelming support to be able to reconfigure and almost move the entire district into a new configuration starting just a couple of years from now.
All right, well, thank you for that, sir. Next question is, how do we create a district-wide culture of continuous improvement to achieve strategic outcomes?
There's several ways to do that. And that's one of the areas that I oversee and been heavily involved in throughout my career. In fact, that was one of the ways I really kind of found my interest in leadership, was first as a teacher being part and leading a school improvement process design. From there, kind of moving into that work and understanding how you pull together different types of metrics to be able to look at that, to be able to segregate that data, to be able to make measurable goals within that, and to really support the systems in place that's needed to be able to move those strategies forward. There's other places too where, preferably I had a little bit of a struggle finding a strategic plan. I'm sure I'll be able to go back and look for that, but sometimes you might start with a strategic plan that outlines very specific and high level goals. And then in support of that, you would flank that with an improvement process that's going to look a little bit more at student outcomes. One of the things that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about is our math equity challenge, and taking a look at the disproportionalities that we have in our higher level math courses based on the demographics of our high school, and recognizing that there's an educational debt that we really need to be able to move into and be able to see if we can't move the system and tailor it so that we can reduce those disproportionate outcomes by moving more demographics into those classroom settings. one of probably the most important things we decided to do was to do empathy interviews with students that have experienced programming K-12 in mathematics and listening to those stories, not necessarily to the point where we were coding, but making sure that we were bringing that together to create some themes on experiences that our students were having and to take a look at the structure of math. It's not always just intervention work that we want to be able to provide our students. Sometimes it's the way the programming is structured or the gates that are at certain points that affect how students move throughout that experience. So you want to be able to look at that in a really dynamic way and be able to study that. There's several different ways, depending on what topic you're looking at, is how you might want to pull data together. And one of the things I think is important too, and it doesn't always show up in your SAT scores. It's not always going to show up in all of your demographic information that you have in front of you. But one of the ways I believe, in addition to all of those other goals and outcomes that you're looking at, is also knowing that sometimes the best way to measure a community is how it takes care of its most vulnerable children within that community. So what are we doing? What are we doing for our students that might have a cognitive impairment or are within our system that might not necessarily show up in some of that other data sets that we tend to value to a little bit more significant level, but often that's because that's the data that's available. So how do we make sure that those hidden stories aren't left out of that conversation just simply because there's not necessarily a measure accompanied with that, and then that story gets left out. So I think it's really important that we take a look at several different aspects. And in addition to that, I want to just stay on academics. How are students experiencing athletics? Do they have access to dynamic programming that takes them outside of the core? What are experiences in the performing arts or the visual arts? All of those things are important. No one of those entities should be left out, but often are not necessarily told in your data story for the district. So it's important to take a measured approach, that we're looking at the whole child and the whole experience of K-12 education, that we're making sure that we're bringing in those stories too and not leaving them out because there's not a already in place data set for that. But relying on things like student empathy interviews, being able to be creative around the way you might collect data to be able to inform a program or decisions around that are important aspects to bring into that. So that's really what I foster in terms of school improvement, is to making sure that we're taking a look at all of those pieces, as well as how do we align that to the strategic plan? How is that informing whether or not the goals within the strategic plan are being realized? How do we direct that? How do we bring and tie that together from those student outcomes to the strategic plan?
Well, very good. Thank you, sir. I was taking a quick time check and we seem to be running a little bit long, so I don't mean to rush you, but I don't want to not ask you all of the questions. So as we move along, if you could possibly shorten up your responses, we don't want to leave any questions unanswered.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Bidlack. Welcome to Anchor Bay. John DeRue, I'm the treasurer of the Anchor Bay School Board. I ask you a couple questions here. What is your biggest concern regarding the political climate of education in Michigan? And as our superintendent, how would you advocate for political action that benefits our district and public education throughout our state?
My biggest concern is around funding and the political climate around that, and really kind of what history shows us. Last time there was an economic crisis. I still think we do not fully understand of the economic impact that once we move through the stimulus money being provided through DC, of how that might impact the state budgets in terms of having shortfalls that move into that. What we learned last time is that education experienced significant financial cuts around that. Keeping in mind that we never really recovered from 2008, 2009. A lot of people really don't know that we did not make it back to the funding levels prior to that financial collapse. And that was several years ago now. So that's probably my number one concern, especially since as we project out, we really truly don't understand the impact that COVID might have on state budgets as we move forward out a year or two beyond where we are right now. And in addition, specifically into that is the way we fund special education programming. And that it's not done in a way that doesn't draw significant amounts of dollars off the general fund, because we're not truly looking at the report of what it takes to educate a child in the state of Michigan. And we're nowhere near close to those type of funding sources. So that would be one of the first partnerships that I would want to forge with the board to help us advocate for the type of funding that Anchor Bay deserves, to make sure that those dollars are coming back to this community in a way that we can provide rigorous and dynamic programming for the children of this community. So that would probably be my number one concern as we move forward.
All right. What are specific ways in which our district should be working with other local districts to foster community partnerships?
Tell me a little bit more about what you're asking about the community partnerships by partnering with other districts. Is that more of maybe I need to rethink community partnerships? I'm probably too far in the weeds.
Yeah, just working with other local districts. I guess when it, guess I'm not really sure how would you better explain that?
That's okay, John. Let me,
Yeah.
I'll take a shot at it. So initially I was thinking of like very specific community project or community partnerships that would be right here. So if I try to think a little bit more broadly in that, it might be through like the Schools of Choice program that Macomb County has. I know that throughout COVID, I think all of those collaborative partnerships have been accelerated. You know, superintendents and central office staffs are collaborating like never before to figure out how are you moving through this particular issue. So probably one of the first areas that is really a support for the community is still staying engaged around the health and safety of each community and sharing those best practices. So that's probably one of the ones that come to mind quickest if I don't stay too much on community-specific based partnerships that we might have unique here to Anchor Bay.
Okay, sorry about that. We got these standardized
That's okay.
questions and all right. What impact has standardized testing and teacher accountability had on our education system in Michigan?
There are multiple lenses in which I could answer that. The first one, probably what I would push on is the way the state used rankings of school district is almost a penalty process for that. So if you're thinking about the top to bottom list and being able to rank every district, and then the consequences that might fall within that. It doesn't mean, and it's important, I want to make sure that I state this really clearly. I'm not against the standardized assessments. I think every district should have a portfolio of assessments that students engage in. As a student, you want them to be successful on a genre of various assessments. You don't want them to only be able to do one specific type of assessments, whether that's formative or summative, or whether that looks more like in a portfolio or it's a performance, or if you're sitting down with paper and pencil or you're taking it electronically. For our children, we want them to be successful no matter what the assessment looks like in front of them. But the manner in which that top to bottom ranking was put together and penalized states or penalized communities certainly was not helpful for that. Yet at the same time, you can pull a lot of useful data off that to be able to take a look at programming structures. So how are SAT scores looking from year to year? How are our third graders doing in reading each year? It does become baseline data for you to be able to compare to other internal assessments that are more useful. So typically speaking, in an educational environment, most standardized tests are not incredibly useful to the teacher in that year, because the timeliness of getting that data back, you're already through the year. By the time you get that back to review it, the student's in a different grade assigned to another teacher. But what it does do, it allows you to look at a little bit at a higher level around programming decisions. And as well as it becomes a way to triangulate the data to let you know your other internal assessments are useful. So for example, if you're using the font de Saint-Pinel in your elementary buildings and you're looking at those data sets and those are completely different than what the M-STEP score is, well, then that tells you that within that diagnostic, you might have a little bit of error in terms of how students are being assessed in that. If they're somewhat in line, then you can trust that font de Saint-Pinel as being very usable data, and that's actionable data for a teacher to use in real time. And it allows them to adjust instruction and put together interventions for that. So it does become a baseline, but one of the concerns I have is the way that that positions districts in terms of penalties around that.
All right, thank you.
I'm Steve Middlestat. I'm secretary of the board. I have a few questions. What's the most difficult situation you've had to deal with in your educational career, and how was it resolved?
I'm trying not to answer with COVID, but it's hard for me to think past it. I mean, it's been incredibly difficult. We are designing and redesigning within a 24-hour period, coming up with new protocols, and putting all of those components together and being incredibly successful as we do that. We built a complete virtual program in about a week. And and as a result of that, we have a whole new virtual campus. And that's one of those areas where, as you move into a challenge, you end up with innovative outcomes. And so even looking past COVID, that's probably one of those innovative outcomes that will probably be sustainable, to be able to offer a virtual campus type experience for students. It's also a new opportunity for tuition students that maybe a barrier before could have been drive time into the district. That can be reduced or eliminated through that type of virtual setting. So it becomes an opportunity to engage in education in new ways. If I move back even past COVID, probably the next thing that comes to mind is the Blue Point system at the high school that was pulled. If you're not familiar, I didn't notice a Blue Point system in the high school as I walked through. So let me just quickly explain what that is. A Blue Point system is almost like a fire alarm, but it goes directly to the police department. So when you pull that, it alerts the police department that there could be an intruder or a situation at the high school that is unsafe for students, and it significantly reduces the response time down to minutes, as opposed to having to rely on a phone call or a plan that's put in place. We had a faulty unit that went off, and the entire district acted just like they should, but it took a while to figure out whether or not that was real. So we lived in a sustained period of time, not too long, not all afternoon, but a good enough portion of time before we realized that there is not an incident taking place inside one of our schools. And so it was a really scary time. I ended up being in the command center just outside that, trying to direct buses where to go, being in touch with my high school principal that was inside, helping the police department clear rooms one at a time, and kind of directing all of that traffic. Everything went just the way it was supposed to go, but that was probably one of the most difficult experiences that I've had personally, just because we didn't really know if that was a active situation. After that, our experience from that was that it caused a lot of trauma, and not only for the staff, but for the students, and then regrouping to be able to help everybody move through that. So because it ended up being a real incident. Yes, there wasn't a violent situation taking place, but it did cause trauma having that experience. And so that was probably another difficult time outside of COVID.
Thank you. Often we have to, you would have to lead, or we often have to lead without having official authority over the people that are involved in a project or a situation. Have you been in a situation before in your career and similar to this? And if so, how do you handle it?
A situation where we're being collaborative in a process, but don't have like positional authority with the people that you're working with.
Right, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's probably quite often the work that I'm engaged in, that, and you want to be able to build a collaborative process to be able to bring people in and empower them. That's probably one of the areas that I find most enjoyable, is trying to figure out what are the barriers that you can remove people, and how do you move them into innovative thought processes. How do you put the conditions in place where they're really going to be able to be creative and drive innovation? A lot of people make the mistake thinking that like being creative or innovative isn't structured. When you take a look at the places that are really pushing innovation, they first fall back on really doing their core business extraordinarily well. So when you take a look at places like Google or Apple, maybe some companies that you might think of as being creative, they're actually very good at their core business first. And then once they have an innovative idea, they're able to rely on that core business to be able to operationalize something new. And so I think it's really important to make sure that you have an infrastructure that when you come across those innovative ideas, you can accelerate that and get that back out. And that may be through different type of feedback, or different type of feedback loops, or making sure that you have the structures in place. But being in a collaborative process where you're empowering people and helping them make some wise decisions. So throughout the work with bond processes, you don't have positional authority over that. Really what you're doing is you're partnering with the community to help them build the schools that they think is best for their children. And so that's probably an example that I would think of right away, where you're really trying to bring stakeholders together, and you have multiple right paths in front of you. There isn't, it doesn't mean that these three options aren't the right direction to go, but what is going to be the best fit for the situation that you're looking at?
All right, thank you. What are the key elements needed to establish and maintain a good working relationship between yourself and the board?
Definitely communication, transparency, understanding where your priorities lie, making sure that I'm connected and reaching out, and that you're doing the same with me as well. And what I've always found with my Board of Education members is you have a very unique set of lenses and perspective, because generally Board of Education members are well networked and get quite a bit of feedback and have a unique perception that nobody else has. So it's incredibly valuable to always be tapping into that to figure out, what is a reaction, or what would you anticipate if we go down this road? It's really a way that partnership can function at a high level, to where you're really helping make wise decisions as we kind of anticipate how to navigate something. I think it's really important to be in two-way communication that isn't always just static, not just emails going back and forth, but rather that we're engaging with people, that we're having retreats, that we really understand what are the goals and objectives that we want to carry out over in the next year. And then when I hear maybe priorities that conflict, being able to identify those for you, and then put those back in front of you to see if we can't hone in and funnel that together. That's going to help us on the other side make sure that we're building systems of coherence, that the priorities aren't 21 where everybody's putting in their 3 priorities, but how do we start with 21 and then funnel that to and raise up, okay, what is collectively the most important things that we're going to do together in the next year or two. So those would be some areas where I really think that's important, to have a trusting relationship, largely dependent on really good communication and understanding where you're at, you helping me with the unique perspectives that you have to be able to make those wise choices. And then also making sure that we have some protocols in place so that it also doesn't overwhelm or move the system along. So a protocol that you might have in place already, I'm not really sure, perhaps a lot of that communication gets channeled through Lisa as the president, and then through me, depending on what what a question might be, or maybe the protocol looks a little bit different. So, but we'd be able to figure that out and establish that together so that we can move forward in a productive way.
Very good. Given your research or knowledge of our district, what do you believe our vision for the future should be? And how might you engage the entire district in pursuit of this vision?
So one of the things I was most excited about looking through all of your programming is the focus around CTE as well as Project Lead the Way and the manners in which you're trying to move making into the classroom. STEAM and STEM is evolving very quickly, and I would describe it as evolving into the makers movement, you know, almost like an MIT approach where it's connecting the hand and mind, that through making, you really understand not only physical structures or complexities, but also the invisible structures and complexities. So what are, what is a social justice issue that we might be able to redesign? What are different forms or things that we could take a look at that still has a design process? If you're, as we prioritize deconstructing racism, even think about that term. It's deconstructing. It really is about design thinking and how you can connect making and engineering along with a priority of equity and inclusion, how you can tie that together. Some of the work that I've been engaged in with Project Zero is around that agency by design, where students gain agency and through a collaborative process, largely around making and innovation. It's working on that innovative mindset, ingenuity in the classroom, and how you spread that throughout curriculum, as well as throughout different programming options. All the while, you're trying to create dispositions of students that on a very high level can look at complexities and be able to take things, be able to take those structures apart and reassemble them in new ways. I think that's going to be incredibly important for the age of our children and the world and economy that they're going to inherit, that they're going to need to be able to reconstruct quite a bit of our economy. They're going to be able to need to reconstruct quite a bit of not only those design processes, but also being able to take a look at the ingenuity mindset. So I think that's probably one of the areas I'm most excited about, is already being on the course of prioritizing those CTEs, some of the making connections that I saw, Project Lead the Way, having that in place. One of the things that I'm stretching in my district is take a look at how are our female students engaging in that as well. So when all of our students in 6th grade are experiencing something, are our 7th grade teachers around design tech visiting those 6th grade classrooms and then surveying the students based on, okay, over those last 4 projects that you did, which ones did you find most enjoyable? Taking a look at those student responses, understanding their perspective so that we can reprogram what 7th grade looks like, so we can move back into those 6th grade classrooms and say, if you liked this project and this project, that's also what we do in design tech. So we can eliminate some of those disproportionate outcomes that we see as students self-select into courses. So making sure that we're taking a look at all of those different pieces while prioritize making, whether that's metaphorically or actually literally.
Thank you. I'm Jill. I'm going to ask you a few questions about instruction and curriculum. Please give us examples of educational change or reform that you have initiated in your current or previous positions that have led to improvements in student learning.
This is probably the area that I'm most passionate on, and I know I'm running long on some of the answers. So I'm going to draw back on and rely a little bit that I've been talking about pedagogy, instruction, and how that stretches. Some of my favorite areas have been neuroscience and teaching, how we're really understanding how we are building those synapses and constructs in the mind, how we push against the idea that you have probably heard this. Well, I'm not good at math. That's probably one of the things that is really commonly phrased. There's no such thing as that. You're not good at math yet. You can always work on those areas of the brain and improve those. There's all sorts of studies where you can grow knowledge into those areas, being able to increase the size of your hippocampus by being able to lay out structures. And a lot of that is connected to those neuroscience connections that you can put within your instructional practices. Language use is another great one. I really love studying absolute versus conditional language and how one opens the mind, the phrasing. So like as a teacher, you might say something like, here's one of the many ways that you could have solved this math problem. right there already, that's telling the students there could be multiple ways within the classroom. And then even after following up with an example, you might ask, what's another way somebody found to do this same problem? Did anybody do it mentally? That now, if you did it mentally, how would you go back and tell the story about drawing that out for someone? So that's just a small example of like absolute versus conditional language, and then how we use that in the classroom. Students grow into the intellectual character that surrounds them. So it's really important to focus on language use and how that sounds in a classroom and how you use that to be able to build instructional practices. I am an instruction guy. That is what draws me to the superintendency, is teaching and learning and what's going to happen in those classrooms. That's what I'm passionate about. So if that's an area where you want your superintendent to lead from, then I am a really good candidate for you. If it's not, I might not be a good fit, because that's really what I am passionate about, is the student experience, pedagogical practices, and teaching and learning, and how that gets shaped, where we're really fostering one's intellectual character, that we're really taking a look at those opportunities that are in the classroom.
Thank you. What do you believe are currently the biggest challenges with special education in our region, and how should those challenges be addressed?
Sure, and I already touched on one of those around funding, and this hits me personally too. My youngest son has significant special needs. And so as a father, so I experienced that as a father. I experienced that as an educator. It really is a significant issue of how special education is funded throughout our state. And also the other resources that are available for parents to have those type of supports that might be present in other regions of our nation. And so that really is problematic, and being able as Board of Education members to be able to be knowledgeable about those areas, to be able to advocate those to our political leaders, I think is a really important form of advocacy for the board that I'd want you to join me in. I've also had the incredibly unique opportunity. It's not that common, but each school that I've been in, within that school has housed a consortium or a center-based program. So like my elementary school had a program for emotionally impaired for 3 school districts. It was housed in that elementary school. My next school that I went to for middle school, I had the ASD program. I had 3 different levels of CI, EI, and being heavily engaged in those programmings and those programming structures. And I always felt like I was at an advantage working and partnering with a parent where I could see something that maybe a team didn't see, which was the struggle on the parent's face, and knowing exactly what that looked like, being able to empathize and being able to support in maybe a different way that you almost have to have that experience yourself to truly understand. So I've been really lucky that each one of my buildings has had a center-based program, because I have always felt like that partnership that I can provide, having that experience myself with a family that might be struggling with their child that has an IEP, that I can empathize at a different level, or maybe be able to recognize something that is taking place that somebody else can't.
Thank you. Last question for me. How would you meet the needs of college readiness while also providing high-quality, relevant, career-focused opportunities for students?
So I don't believe in the premise that these have to be 2 separate things. One of the things that I'm doing in Bloomfield, at Bloomfield High School, is supporting the ongoing work to be able to build pathways. And what a pathway is almost like you might enter into a university where you concentrate on a specific area of study so that you're really gaining expertise through a specific topic area. So a couple of examples that we're going to have online shortly is like media arts, we're looking at agriculture and food technologies, biomedical, and that way we can structure the way you move throughout our programming to almost have a concentrated area of focus so that you're leaving with that as well. And that is preparation for whether or not you're going to jump in at an entry level, or that you're going to move on to, you're going to jump into that career at an entry level, or you're going to move on to a university level and still continue that pathway. Or, which children often do, is they change their mind. They have tried that and now they don't have to spend a couple years figuring out at a very costly rate that that's not an area of interest of theirs. So being able to design that instruction that allows kids to move throughout a pathway and being able to try to connect that back to early grade level so that students can have that time and experience in that. Also, I think you're already moving to some of those steps to make sure that you are career and college ready and having a balanced approach around those making dispositions. Often people describe those as STEAM or STEM. I'm a little bit more familiar with the evolution of where that's going and the maker empowerment movement and how that type of disposition fostered over time really lends itself to multiple career and pathways, because what it's really doing is fostering a design thought process, which is applicable to no matter what direction you take in life. If you have a disposition to be able to design, that will lend itself well to a lot of different pathways.
I'm Dennis Richards, school board trustee. I have 4 questions around finances. What is your experience with millage renewals, bond proposals, and sinking fund proposals? What is the key to the success of such initiatives?
I've already talked about bond initiatives a little bit, so you probably kind of have already a gauge for the type of work that I've been involved on that. Sinking funds, it's important to have that structure if it's available to you, because that allows you to renew or maintain some of those pieces that you really need to be improving every couple of years. Otherwise, it's going to draw from your general fund. So it's important to have a balanced portfolio on that, where you're paying down bond debt, looking for the opportunity to go back and whether through a millage or a sinking fund, be able to capture dollars back. Oftentimes, when you're doing that, you're able to go back for a 0% tax increase to be able to continue that model and really help sustain the stability of your physical assets in the community or in the district, that you're able to maintain those over time. Along with Headley Amendment, I didn't get a chance to look at where you're at with your Headley Amendment, whether or not you're able to collect that 18 mills or not. I'm assuming based on some of the financial reporting that I look like that's not an issue that's in front of you right now. But if it does become an issue, a lot of people are confused on that. So it really ends up just being more of like a marketing knowledge campaign. And then once people understand it, generally that passes overwhelmingly, but it's usually misunderstood in terms of what that looks like. It looks like you've been very successful with major bond initiatives that have kept your facilities up to date, which means that as a consequence, it shouldn't be drawing off your general fund in significant ways, because if a boiler goes down, you're going to repair that boiler. So the strategy is to make sure that you're through sinking funds or through bond projects, that those type of situations don't surprise you. And now you're having to divert money that you had planned or earmarked for programming or instruction, suddenly now has to go to that type of project.
Please describe your experience with budget development and financial management, including making difficult budget reductions.
So I've had quite a bit of experience with both of those. I was describing the financial crisis that we all went through. You were probably going through the same type of issues at the time. I think most districts were feeling that. It's looking for the opportunities in that. How do you do that in a very humane way, in a healthy way? And of course, I'm talking about something pretty dire. Most of the time, what we're looking at is how do we take advantage or prepare, or what does the outlook look like? What's really challenging is that, our fiscal timeline does not match the distribution or the fiscal timeline of the state. So oftentimes what we're doing is we're taking our best guess at what a projected budget might look like. and then making sure that we're making those budget adjustments along the way to the best of our ability, based on what actually happens throughout the year. You know, with COVID, that's been extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I was incredibly worried this time last year. Nobody really knew what that was going to look like. We were preparing for all sorts of scenarios. You were probably doing that as well. And then as more information comes out from the state, then it allows you to go, okay, we're probably looking at some of these scenarios, and it keeps funneling down until you feel like, okay, we got a pretty good projection. One of the most important things is to always be looking at growth, population growth rates, looking at birth rates, really knowing and being confident in your enrollment numbers and what those are going to look like in the next 3 years. That's probably one of the most important pieces for planning, because it allows you to be responsive and proactive around staffing, so that you don't get to a situation where you are spending more on staffing than the enrollment that is coming in. So, you know, how do you always look out at those projections and making sure that you have confidence around the algorithms that's giving you information on those enrollment numbers?
What opportunities do you believe budget limitations present? In tough financial times, what are your top 3 priorities?
So in tough financial times, my top 3 priorities is trying to keep any negative impact away from the student. So what I mean by that is not to really steer clear of reducing programming options, to understand that you don't, or to be able to, or trying to avoid cost structures that might limit access to maybe an extracurricular item or athletic item. Make sure that you're really thinking with the student in mind and staying student-centered, that we want to be able to keep that impact away from the student experience. Outside of that, you really want to be collaborative with your union and bargaining groups to be able to be, you know, really the process that I take is that those are our challenges together, and that we're going to come in the room and together solve those. That there isn't going to be necessarily a selection of answers that are provided ahead of time, but rather together as a collective unit, how might we address some of these budget limitations that we're looking at? Sometimes within those budget limitations, you come up with really innovative ideas around that, of how you might be able to gather in more revenue for that. Perhaps there's a new idea around shared time services, or maybe there's a new opportunity with CTEs. Perhaps virtual programming is something that you haven't necessarily considered before in terms of attracting schools of choice students, because now no longer are those students necessarily have to come within a 30-minute drive of your school district. So oftentimes through those limitations, you find some of those areas of innovation, and being able to implement those can put you on a healthier course in terms of what some of those revenue pieces are. So looking at those pieces with shared time services, CTEs, also being very transparent in that process, sharing those challenges with your collective bargaining groups, and doing that in a transparent way that really everybody's responsible for the financial health of the organization.
This is my last question. What opportunities might you explore to raise additional revenue for the district? Have you had success in procuring additional funds for your district?
Sure, and I just gave some examples for that. So I won't be repetitive in that response. Rather, I'll add on to it. So just this week, what we were taking a look at was alternative ed program. And, you know, we're really not quite the size district where we would have a significant amount of students in an alternative ed program that is really sustainable. But yet that's an incredibly important service to be able to provide, even if it's for a very small segment of students. But usually the services that you need is going to be like a foundation of staffing to be able to provide that type of support. Yet you could add students into that cohort without adding staffing to that. So taking a look at criterion-based options to be able to pull more kids and create more opportunities for students to come into the district to experience probably what we've been designing behind the scenes to probably be the best alternative ed program in the state of Michigan. and then looking at how do we take a criterion-based schools of choice program and then offer that outside of our district to be able to pull more students into that, not to double or triple the size of that program, but to really get two primary benefits from that. One, the first one is really through a student experience lens, which is providing more students in the classroom to create more of a school feel. Because if you get too small, it stops feeling like a school setting. And the second one on that is making sure that that program is efficient and is running as close to being sustainable as possible. It doesn't mean that you have to break even on an alternative ed program, but it certainly helps the stability of the district if it can get closer to that. So those, that's one example of where you might take a look at that, as well as, and I'm not suggesting that's what Anchor Bay needs to do, but rather I'm using that as an example of how you would take a look at different programming options to see if those opportunities sit there and look at almost through an efficiency lens of what is sustainable and then what is drawing back from the general fund more than what it is, more than what the FTEs for that particular area supports.
Thank you.
All right, sir, I've got your final 4 questions, and they are surrounding staffing and personnel interactions. How would you interact with administrators in our district? How would you strike a balance between giving them the support and the autonomy they need to lead effectively while holding them accountable as appropriate and necessary?
I think that's a great question. And so in terms of administration, I'm going to think on multiple levels from cabinet to building administration. And I think it's important to have routines in place to have those type of engagements. So, having regular cabinet meetings, being able to connect one-on-one, be able to help with goal setting and priority setting, yet also giving the people the autonomy and authority that they need to be successful in their position, really listening for, what would help you move forward on this particular item right here. In addition to that, in my 90-day plan, you'll see that I carve out specific strategies on this of being able to engage with your, making sure I'm developing a relationship right away with your interim superintendent, moving into cabinet, also making sure that I am meeting with all of our building administrators and then establishing a routine where there would be check-ins or informal walkthroughs of the buildings, which is an opportunity for them to tell me what's going on, as well as be able to provide any feedback to keep them in the loop. And then of course there's district administration meetings. And so making sure that all of those things are calendared, and that's something that we would even be able to do well before September starts, to be able to make sure that that time and space has been established that would create that type of structure and routine to be able to foster those type of relationships and really to do what your question suggested, which is to maintain those relationships, yet having high standards.
All right, please describe your most successful experience in building a high-performing team at work.
That's probably one of my, that is really fun to do. It is really fun to engage in that work because the motive in that too is when you do that at a very high level, that's really when you start to see the evidence of a culture of innovation and creative thinking start to appear. That's when that really starts to become alive. That's based on a lot of trust. That's making sure that there's structures and routines in place, and being able to foster that type of dialogue that really empowers people and making sure that they feel welcomed and there's an inclusive environment in which they can share and give feedback and be able to think collectively with other people. So high functioning teams, that's an area that I really like to study, and as well as bring some of those techniques in to make sure that that's the core of the work, that needs to be in place so that everybody can go back and then do the same thing within their setting and to be able to foster and build those high functioning teams as well. I've done that in every place that I've been. That's one of the areas that I really pride myself on is creating those high functioning teams. I mentioned that Sashabaw Middle School, when I was brought there, was described to me as that they had experienced a few difficult transitions at the leadership level, and they were looking for somebody to really kind of bring that staff back together. And that's what I did. That was my first, that was my first objective. And as soon as we did that, we were able to start leading the district right from the middle school level. Same thing moving over to Delta County. They had experienced a couple of difficult transitions too at the leadership level, which is why the recruiting aspect occurred, being familiar with the work taking place at Sashbaugh Middle School, not only with cultures of thinking, but the dynamic of teams. That's kind of what drew me into that position to be able to do that. So creating those teams, high-performing teams, is really important to me. And it's actually part of my expectation setting that collectively, we're all trying to put the conditions in place that promotes that.
How would the president of your teachers union describe you?
So Phil, I work with Phil. He's president of the BHEA. And one of the things is I would really encourage any one of you to contact him. And what he will tell you is that I'm very collaborative, that we work on problems together, that I am always willing to listen, and that our problems are collective problems. Our issues are collective issues, and that we work on those things together. One of the ways that a recent compliment that Phil gave me was that he believes that when the district moves into an area where it gets stuck and that there doesn't seem to be a solution to be able to apply to a specific situation, and probably like you've experienced a lot of those throughout the last 13 months. One of the compliments that he gave me recently was that being creative and kind of stepping back and thinking outside of that situation to be able to apply a new logic to it and move everybody into that type of thinking process. He identified me as being able to move the group into a new way to solution around something specific in a creative way, and was expressing appreciation for that, because then we don't stay stuck admiring an issue, but yet we can then transcend out of that and then start applying some solutions that would work.
Okay, sir. And the last question. What would you suggest in terms of a comprehensive professional development plan for our educators? Specifically, what would be the key priority areas as well as your delivery system?
Yes, and I think we can all start thinking about professional development different after the last 13 months. Some of the direction that I just recently gave as we prepare for professional development. In fact, we had all of our teacher leaders over in learning services this morning. And one of the directions I asked for us to take is that, as we look at professional development, it is probably not a the state of which we experience that is probably just like we've experienced the last 13 months. Some of that's going to be virtual, some of that's going to be hybrid, and some of that's going to be in person. How do we identify what opportunities match well with whatever the professional development or professional learning is? Another way that I really like to do that, and I didn't really get a chance to talk about it too much, so maybe I'll take the opportunity right here to do this a little bit, is I'm very deeply invested on models of teacher leadership. And how specifically you design that to flatten the organizational structure, that you're making that a little bit more horizontal as opposed to a pyramid or a top-down structure. How do you place teachers in the position, not only to where you're building your bench for your next administrators, but you're also empowering them to make leadership decisions. One of the areas that I think our teacher leaders are extraordinarily helpful on is setting direction on professional development learning, listening for what do you need next. I mean, that's a really simple question to ask your music department. What do you guys need to be focusing on next year? What support do you need from the district? How can we help you do that? Okay, what's a way that we would structure that professional development and build that out for next year? And then yet pulling in alongside that as we do that. So we identify what those goals and areas of focus are for each, maybe a grade level team or department area. And then alongside that, then put in the board's goals, the district goals, and see how can we align these, or Or if you don't see something present here, how do we now fold that in so that that can be part of it? So like if we're focusing on agency by design, but that wasn't necessarily identified with a professional development portfolio for a specific area, then we go back and say, what are some opportunities where that could fit in there so that we're still taking a look at the priorities of the district, yet also meeting the needs within that and being responsive to what that department or grade level team feels they need and is what's most important to them. So being able to do that in a very balanced way so that it really ends up being a portfolio. We can deliver that now through multiple formats, just like we've experienced in the last year. We've been doing that for 13 months now, and that's probably the way we're always going to do professional development. There's also techniques around badging for specific priority areas. So one of the areas that we're exploring for badging is with diversity training, with culturally responsive teaching, where, because this is a priority and we want to have inclusive environments for all of our students, that we are taking a look at and making sure that we're offering these experiences. And then you can get badged on that, which also tells us along the way, okay, this is the proportion of the of our instructional staff right now that has that particular badging or has participated in that training or professional learning, which then can inform back to the strategic plan, because if that's a priority, now we can start taking a look at that outcome and those ratios. If we see that's under, then we know that, well, we might have to provide more professional development, more opportunities for that, for teachers to be able to engage in that process. So looking at a really dynamic blend of those opportunities, asking our teachers what they need, they will tell you. They will tell you what we should be working on next. And then seeing how we can't match that with some of the district and building priorities as well.
Okay, we have a few minutes, so we want to provide you with an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have for the board.
Well, I've been doing quite a bit of research on your district, as well as connecting with some of the people who maybe have recently taking positions outside the district. And I feel like I've been getting a lot of really good information in terms of understanding the dynamic and what some of your focus areas are. I know that you're also in a time of transition and looking and really wanted to prioritize, you know, being forward thinking and moving forward. And because of that, I think that I bring a particular skill set and experience doing exactly that, helping different school communities that I have helped lead through that transition and be able to just be future focused. That's where I've been leading the district throughout these last 13 months is, yes, we're going to manage and yes, we're going to manage the crisis that's right in front of us. But while we're doing that, we're also going to remain future focused. I think some of the areas probably that are still holes for me, I wasn't able to locate or find a strategic plan. So I'm not familiar yet what might be in that. So I would be curious around what some of those priorities that might be stated in there. I was able to read through a lot of different reports. I think I have a pretty good understanding of your demographic information, your student outcomes, your position in the county, how competitive you are with other area school districts. So all of that is really transparent on the website. So I really commend you for having that present. It's very easy to move into that. Addition to that, I've since applying, I've visited your community a couple times now. So once as recent as this last weekend, making sure that I drove past every single facility, familiarized myself with the area, and as well as the community, you know, kind of imagining what some of those bus routes would look like. Also in the 90-day plan, you'll see where I put specific things of people that I would want to make connections with to better understand. So I feel like I'm prepared to really immerse myself into some of that. But I guess one of the questions I could ask is, you know, absent of that document really reading into that, would right now as a group of 7, would you be able to name what your 3 top priorities are? Or is that a conversation you might be actively engaged in right now and then would have that perhaps, which both of those answers are right and appropriate. So I'm kind of wondering where you might be in that process.
I think for myself, I can say that we have 2 new board members. And as of January of this year, and then a few of us were new as of 2 years prior to that, so I think some of those things are things that we're still working through as our board keeps evolving lately. And so that we are trying to come to a consensus on our priorities at that point. But if any of the other board members would like to jump in, if they feel inclined, you're welcome to.
Well, Lisa, I can tell you, I think that's an exciting place to be. And the reason why I was digging for that a little bit is one, I will stop digging for that information. But also one of the things I believe is like any strategic plan that was created in education before COVID-19 is very likely obsolete. That strategic plan was not made with virtual classrooms in mind. It was not, there was a lot not in context of what our current situation is. I think it's incredibly valuable right now to start engaging in the work to prepare for a real strategic planning process, because education is not going to go back in the box that we were in prior to COVID-19, because we're going to want to be able to draw from our history on the things that we know worked very well and in fact sustained us through COVID-19. But then also, what are some of those exciting pieces of innovation that popped out either here in Anchor Bay or in other areas that we might now want to put into the context of a new strategic plan so that we can formulate that together. So I think it's an exciting place to be in a transition for a strategic plan. Even if there was one very well developed, I'm not so sure how useful it would be now that we've experienced this last year. So I think that's a good place to be right now.
We have a couple minutes remaining, about 5 minutes or so. If there's anything in closing that you would like to add for the board.
I'll just, simply end where I started, which is thanking you for this opportunity, thanking the community for their participation. Hopefully you'll get some good feedback. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to clarify or provide more information if needed. I'll leave you with my 90-day plan. I also have a couple letters of reference in there. I did not include the union president though, but that was a good question. So if you would like to reach out to Phil Liberty, I can get you that contact information. Oftentimes a union president will contact another union president. So maybe somebody will do that for you. So usually once you kind of narrow down to a few people, they will start making contacts. So you might be able to get that information another way. But I'm just going to leave with the same way I came in, which is thank you for the opportunity. It looks like an incredible school district. It very much reminds me of the experience in the community in which I grew up in. And, I think probably one of your greatest strengths in this area is to have, at least what I'm perceiving is diversity around socioeconomic status. And I think that there's real exciting ways to be able to harness that and to be able to leverage that as a strength of the community. I have quite of experience in that myself as an individual with the way I grew up, as well as also in a very diverse set of experiences that I've had that also would represent a very wide range of socioeconomic status based on the settings that I've been. So I come with that perspective, both personally and professionally, and I'm excited about that. I think it's a beautiful community, and I would be excited for that work.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Bidlack, we appreciate your interest in the superintendent position for Anchor Bay. The board is interviewing 5 candidates this week, and we will let you know Friday night where you stand in our search process. And thank you for your participation tonight in our first round interviews.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to the entire board. Thank you.
And you're welcome to approach if you want to pass out your
Thank you.
your documents.
The
that you brought.
clarification helps because, thank you. Great question.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Pulled it all together.
right, at this point in time, we're going to move into open forum. You are welcome, community members, either present or virtual, are welcome to address the board. You're reminded to please stick to the agenda items as well as not to address individuals personally through this forum. So I don't believe there are any in-house. Mr. Sizemore, could you advise if we have any virtual speakers?
I don't see any at this time, no.
Okay, thank you. Great, and at that point, then I will take a motion to adjourn.
Ms. Berkmeyer, I just have one question. The process tomorrow, we'll do one interview and then what's the next step again? Just,
So tomorrow will consist of only one interview, and then we will be meeting on Friday at 5:30 as well. And that will be for the board to come to a consensus to narrow down our candidates further for the next round. I was asked, because tomorrow won't be quite as long as today and yesterday, if we were able to speed up that process. Unfortunately, we cannot because we'd be waiting for the feedback that we're receiving from community members, either in-house or virtually, so that we can gather that and get that to the board members for review before we come back and narrow down our selections further.
okay, that's good. Thanks.
You're welcome. I had a motion from Mr. DeRue to adjourn. Is there a second? Okay, supported by Mr. Green, and if we could call the roll.
Mr. DeRue,
Yes.
Mr. Green,
Yes.
Ms. Berkmeyer,
Yes.
Ms. Knox,
Yes.
Mr. Richards,
Yes.
Mr. Middlestate, yes.
Okay, at 8:46, the meeting is adjourned. And again, we will be back tomorrow, Thursday, for one final interview at 5:30 for Mr. Philip Jankowski. And so tomorrow we'll only have one remaining interview, and everybody have a good night.